Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56. Dmitri cursing virulently, he spun around as Akiran's body hit the ground and shouted, "They're above us," at the soldiers leaving the fortress. The formations that had scattered to avoid the opening meteor strike were scrambling to reform. Thankfully, many of the long-standing guard on the bridge were archers and snipers. They had quickly taken up in the fortress blind over a dozen yards south of his position and were firing volleys through the rain at the flying squadron above them. "Get somebody inside, ring the bells to sound the alarm," Claude was shouting after letting out a ear-piercing whistle. Somehow, Dmitri suspected it had something to do with Fail Not. Honestly, his voice reached his devoted mount's ear. He heard the distant shriek of a very surprised and very angry wyvern. "Unless you're an archer, form up in groups of 10 and keep mobile. I give it a few seconds before one of the mages casts again. Stay still and you'll get hit." "Your Highness." Did his voice, suddenly coming from directly behind him, nearly made him spin around and attack his dear friend. Thankfully he managed to snare and hold on to his wits, instead accepting his friend's hand and bolting for entrance to the wooden bridge on the other side of the fortress tower. "How can they see their targets through this rain?" Mercedes asked, appearing in his peripheral vision as another blaze of golden light arced up toward the sky. Dmitri spent precious seconds twisting his head to catch a glimpse of Byleth swinging the Creator's sword at the sky. Claude was at her side in an instant, pulling her along as her attack knocked another enemy from the sky. "Pegasi can't fly well in this weather, and the visibility is terrible." "Most likely, sheer discipline." Annette's voice was a pleasant surprise. Usually she was a late sleeper, especially when the weather was like this. "I think they must be part of the Vestra School of Magic. They're famous for the intensive training that mages don't usually receive, including fighting in intense weather like this. The use of meteor is also a dead giveaway." The four of them skidded to a halt a few feet away from the foot of the bridge. Dmitri looked along its length and eyed the ballista tucked away in a safe corner for a minute before dismissing the possibility. He hadn't been training with a bow for that long, and there was an even odd chance he'd end up breaking it given his current mood. Giving his head a shake, he peered around the corner to take stock of what was going on with the remaining troops the traitor had brought with him. Rodrigue and Judith had found each other very quickly, and side by the side they were tearing apart the armored and mounted knights that had followed the corpse of a backstabbing lord that now soaked the bridge in his blood. Aura would blast an armored knight into a wall, giving Judith an opening to blur past a rearing horse and slice off the buckles holding a saddle in place. When the rider fell from his mount, she finished him off as soon as he hit the stone. Rodrigue threw a javelin over her shoulder as she knelt to do this work, injuring another horse and causing it to throw its rider directly at two of the bridge guard, who ensured that he stayed down. While this was happening, another meteor fell from the storming heavens, aimed at another group of the bridge guard. Thankfully, however, Claude's tactics were already paying out. The group darted past the area that the spell targeted. The burning rock still struck the bridge hard enough to shake the ground they were standing on. Annette shrieked and almost overbalanced before Dida caught her. A white blur in the corner of his eye. Dmitri actually felt himself smile when he tilted his head and saw Claude swing up onto Ivory's back, without a saddle, and take to the sky. "She's certainly special," he mused. "I knew I should have taken up horseback riding. Being stuck on foot like in the middle of this is scary." Annette whined, biting her lip. "What should we do, Dmitri? That horrible lord must have opened other avenues for the Empire to climb the bridge. Is there any way to change that?" "Not from here, and if we go ahead ourselves, we risk being overrun." Dmitri bit his lip and carefully scrambled across the rain-soaked wooden bridge. It wobbled under his footsteps, and looking down was a big mistake. Hundreds of yards below, a river rushed so quickly around various pointed stones the water was white. Swallowing hard, he successfully crossed and stopped at the edge of a tower, leaning forward to scout forward. The stone road was thinly defended, only a few dozen soldiers of various practices. Fortunately, there was no sign of breakthrough yet. "Should we cut the bridge here, Your Majesty?" Didu asked, his voice strained to call over the rain and thunder. Dmitri glanced back and saw his friend indicating the rope bridge that ran side by side with the stone walkway. "Hold that thought for now," he called back, moving to rejoin them. "Any avenue of movement that we close is one we won't be able to use either." We should dash. There you are. The voice came from above him, nearly drowned out by the rain and the screams and sounds of battle. Fortunately, Dimitri's battlefield awareness had always been excellent. He heard the vaguely familiar voice and immediately snapped his head up toward the sky. Through the rain, he could see a shadow hurtling down toward him. It was surrounded by a faint white haze. Watch out! He warned his friends as he threw himself to the right, running as quickly as he dared over the shaky wooden bridge. His feet slipped on the sodden wood, causing him to fall to one knee. Cursing, he pulled himself back up by the ropes and kept moving. No one can fight on this surface. Dimitri! Mercedes cried in fear as the wyvern swooped down, raising its front arms so all four legs were aimed at his back. He just wasn't fast enough. You're going down. Annette's voice cracked like a whip as she cast Sagitt, striking the wyvern as it came so close to grabbing him. The magic blow staggered the creature, allowing Dimitri to scramble the last few feet across the wooden bridge. Spinning around, he unsheathed his silver lance and glared up at their opponent. Claude had described the wyvern general he'd fought in the sky at Gareg Mach to him. It was hard to tell thanks to the rain and low light, but Dimitri was fairly certain this was the same woman. Claude suspected she was a new appointment, gaining her position due to a mixture of competence and fanatical loyalty to Edel, to that witch. He'd also said that she would fight no matter the odds against her. She won't stand down. So be it. Something in his heart keened, despite the hot rage pumping through his veins. Dimitri tried to push it away, but it remained underneath everything else he'd felt since that mask broke in the holy tomb. Blade did. For the future of Fodlan that Her Majesty envisions, you must vanish. The woman shouted, her wyvern circling above them. Dimitri bit his lip hard enough to taste blood. El is dead, his father said sternly. The Flame Emperor killed her, the least you can do is avenge her death. The wyvern surged down towards them. Both Annette and Mercedes cast magic at her in retaliation. Annette's hand glowed with white light, surprising him, seconds before she cast Abraxas. The strongest light spell in recorded history. When had she found the time to learn it? That must be why she and Lysithea have been sitting beside each other so often whenever we made camp. They were using the downtime to learn just a little bit more. Wyverns did not like magic. What they had above Pegasi in physical prowess, they lacked in the innate magical resistance. Abraxas must have hit that woman's mount like an avalanche. It let out an unholy-sounding shriek and lost all momentum, dropping several feet before regaining its bearings. Dida darted between it, its rider and the girls. Dimitri took the opportunity to throw a javelin at the woman, more to keep her off her game than doing serious damage. She jerked hard on the reins of her mount. The weapon missed, vanishing over the bridge and down into the ravine below. Scowling fiercely, she took a tomahawk from her belt and flung it directly at his face. Dida was already moving, however, and pulled Dimitri out of the way, causing it to harmlessly slam into the stone wall behind him. Mercedes acted quickly, Balganone flying from her fingertips the instant Dimitri was safe. The woman swore, pulling harshly on the reins again so the wyvern moved up. The flames only grazed it as a result, but some burns on the creature's scales that he could see proved that they had done some damage already. Now that she was close to the ground, however, Dimitri could see the source of the pale white haze surrounding her. It was a silver shield buckled against the wyvern's chest. A familiar one, too. Claude called it the Aurora Shield, the ultimate protection against arrows and other physical weapons, projectile or otherwise. She's definitely one of the witch's favorites. As quickly as the thought struck him, he shifted into a ready stance. She's probably the overall commander for the attack. If we take her out. The woman whistled sharply, and a chorus of answering voices from other knights answered her. A battalion of a dozen Pegasi and wyvern riders began to cut through the sky towards them. Dimitri said something that would have made Felix arch an eyebrow at him before and started moving backwards as quickly as he could. Come on, he urged Annette, who was frozen with panic. We need to mo dash. He didn't even get a chance to finish. A pair of horses whinnied and the air was full of arrows. Dimitri twisted over his shoulder and relief replaced his panic so quickly he almost got whiplash. Ash, Bernadetta, and Sylvain had appeared from behind them as if by magic. No, not any magic, Suthies. Byleth must have perceived this happening. How many uses of divine pulse was this for her? She said she could use more, but how many more? Bernadetta was already aiming again, controlling her horse with just her legs as her crest's light surrounded the killer bow right before she unleashed a ghostly storm. Ash was right behind her. It looked like Claude had given him his brave bow after getting fail not, because his rate of fire, while obviously not as intense as Bernadetta's, was much faster than it had any right to be. Sylvain, meanwhile, rode past them and offered Dimitri his hand. The young king accepted that with a grin and let himself be hauled up onto the black horse's back. The screams of the flying creatures struck by this arrow storm made him cringe sympathetically. Annette must have been feeling it quite keenly, because he saw her hug Mercedes's arm as several of their enemies either dropped out of the air completely or stumbled down to an ungraceful landing, shying away from their current tormentors. Their riders, knowing they couldn't force their mounts back in the air, dismounted and charged. This Dimitri could work around. While Ash and Bernadetta circled around Annette and Mercedes, protecting them while they fired magic attacks at the general who was flying overhead, trying to get at them, and firing arrows anyone who got too close, Sylvain spurred forward directly at their mounted and unmounted enemies. The lance of ruin glowed like a torch in the rainstorm as the redhead brought it down on a stocky man wielding a silver lance. The impact tore through him, spraying him, and Dimitri, thankfully less so for him, with a geyser of blood. Sylvain spat the liquid out, wincing, and muttered a quick prayer under his breath before moving on. He urged his horse straight at the formation the downed men had formed, the lance pointed straight forward. While initially they tried to hold firm, several bolted out of the way, resulting in the redhead's horse rearing up and slamming its front hooves onto the raised shield obstructing it from the rest of their enemies. Dimitri slashed his lance out and down, piercing through a woman's shoulder and sending her to the ground. Didu blurred past them, his silver gauntlets ablur as he unleashed a flurry of attacks on one of the wyvern riders, pummeling the man into submission. The man's partner tried to knock Didu down by hitting him in the back of the head with the butt of his axe. Didu merely turned, gave him a dry look, and put him down with a technique Balthus had taught him, draining blow, he'd called it. Channeling a little magic through the gauntlets in a way that mimicked the crest of Regan's life-draining effect. Sylvain led his horse in a circle around Didu, swinging his lance to the left and the right. Whatever enemy wasn't torn apart by it took injuries deep enough that they simply sank to the floor, trying to stem the bleeding as best they could. The fight drained out of them. Dimitri wasn't idle. As soon as their enemies on the ground were taken care of, his attention went back to the sky. The general woman was circling far above Annette, Mercedes, Ash, and Bernadetta. The latter two were trying to shoot her down as best they could despite the effects of the Aurora shield. Occasionally Annette and Mercedes fired magical attacks at her, but the woman had not been raised to her rank for nothing. Largely, she was avoiding them. Then she threw a tomahawk down. It was falling towards. He didn't even get a chance to shout a strained warning as Sylvain turned them around. Didu was faster. He bolted past Bernadetta's horse, nearly getting kicked in the process, grabbing Mercedes, and giving Annette a push that knocked her past Ash. When the tomahawk fell, it struck him in the middle of the back, burying through his leather. It hit where it did because he had pulled Mercedes against his chest and hunched over to take the blow. Dimitri's vision blurred red. He discarded the silver lance he'd been using and drew Eridbar from its sheath on his back. He didn't like using a hero's relic against rank-and-file soldiers. It always seemed unnecessarily cruel. But right in that moment, it didn't matter. He jumped from the back of Sylvain's horse, striding forward as the woman angled her wyvern into a dive. Bernadetta and Ash split apart, backing away and trying to shoot her down with. Annette cried in panic and tried to pull Didu out of the way. He couldn't really move, with where the tomahawk had hit him, while Mercedes pulled herself free of his protective hold, tears staining her face. The woman readied her axe as she approached. Annette raised a hand in defense. Dimitri stepped over his friend's fallen form and raised Eridbar over his head. "This battle is over," he said with a calm he didn't feel. The orange lance lit up like a dying sun. He threw it upward with all the strength his crest allowed, pushing the magic through the blade for one end. Since he was right below her, the woman didn't see it coming. Eridbar pierced through the wyvern's stomach just below the Aurora shield and slammed straight through the creature, coming out its back and piercing through her armor to her stomach. She only had time to gasp and realize what was about to happen to her when it happened. That was when atrocity kicked in. Eridbar was occasionally called the Devil's Lance because of the unique ability it held within. When activated, Eridbar would pierce through its opponent's armor and then unleash a destructive burst of magic that exploded within the enemy like 1,000 lances. It targeted all vital organs, be they human or beast, and tore them to bloody shreds. The enemy might die instantly, might die choking on their own blood, might go into shock and die from bleeding out, but they always died in terrible pain. The Ovyurn's body practically burst above them, drenching him and the others in its blood. The woman's body, Eridbar still buried within, dropped to the ground a few feet away. Dmitri lowered his hand from his face, shuddering as he swept some gore from his hair, before dropping to his knees next to Didu. "What can I do?" he asked desperately as Mercedes examined the wound as carefully as possible. Didu grunted, perhaps intending to reassure him somehow, but ended up coughing and spitting up a mouthful of blood. "Help me get it out," Mercedes responded, hiccuping as she tried to force down her distress. "Pull it straight up, don't wiggle it, or the wound will be torn further. Please dash." "I have this," Dmitri said. The roar of a demonic beast echoed after a crash of thunder. He grasped the tomahawk, forcibly taking a calming breath and willing his hands to steady, despite the following roars that accompanied the first. 2, 3, 4, 4 at least. The Empire troops are on the bridge proper. He gritted his teeth, then pulled hard. Thankfully, the weapon came out cleanly despite everything. Mercedes immediately cast heal. Moments later Annette was at her side to cast recover on top of it. The large, ugly wound sealed up with nary a scar left behind, Didu straightened up, rolling his shoulders back and giving them a faintly relieved smile. "Thank you," he said easily. Mercedes let out a choked sob and threw herself at him, hugging him as tightly as though the world would fall apart if she let go. Didu looked briefly startled, then properly apologetic when Dmitri did his best to scowl at his friend through his relief. He patted her gently on the back and gave her a moment before urging her to stand up. "The battle will not wait for us," he reminded them. "Right. I'll yell at you later," Dmitri said in a deadpan voice. Annette burst into startled laughter as he walked over to retrieve Eridbar. The woman's body, his stomach revolted when he looked at her. It wasn't quite pulp and mush, but it was close. Dmitri lost his fight with his gag reflex and leaned against the stone pillar, vomiting at least twice before he could settle his stomach. Making a point of looking past her, Dmitri carefully pulled Eridbar loose and stepped over her to reach the battlefield proper. A white form flickered overhead, accompanied by a massive golden glow. Dmitri jerked his head up to see Claude, wielding Fail Not, and aiming it, behind him. A massive golden arrow flew down and struck the stone passageway beyond them. A demonic beast's screech hit his ears. Seconds later, another golden arrow flew down faster than the eye could track and struck the beast again. Black dust was sent flying everywhere by the impact that killed it. Ivory's glimmering form dipped down. He only knew it was Ivory because of Failnot's arrows. A mirage had formed around her, rippling waves of color and fog that distorted the very air around her. It spread out around the wyvern, making it impossible to know where to fire to hit her. Dmitri could see, even through the increasingly heavy rain, dozens of arrows flying harmlessly through the mirage as Claude flew over the enemy army and fired again and again, circling overhead, aiming to do as much damage as possible while the mirage lasted. "Goddess, but you are a sight," Dmitri murmured tenderly, mostly to himself. Then he clapped his hands together and said, "We should retreat and find Byleth." He didn't have time to curse himself for using her first name, so he just forged onward. "Hopefully the army is somewhat organized for a counter-attack, we not of much use out here." "The professor sent us to come get you," Ash said urgently, offering his hand to Annette, who gratefully took it and was lifted up onto his horse. Sylvain pulled him up onto horseback again as Didu and Mercedes stood. "Everyone's awake and armed, at least," Bernadetta said meekly. "Of course, most of the mounts are still in the stables, some people have gone to get them, but it will take time." "Then we'll make time," Sylvain responded confidently. "Let's go." The 7 of them scrambled out of the corner of the bridge and back toward the small fortress on the bridge. Dmitri glanced back where Claude was flying over the enemy army and swore bitterly at the sight. There were at least 5 demonic beasts now standing on the bridge, along with rows and rows of mages, armored knights, and men on horseback. However, their aerial combatants were gone, they'd all been taken out. Having defeated the last of their airborne opponents, Claude wheeled around and began to make his way back, the mirage starting to stream behind him as it began to disperse. "Be careful," he pleaded silently. "Dimitri," Rodrigue called in relief as Sylvain made his way back to the fortress. Dimitri smiled apologetically, clasping the older man's hand to reassure him. Byleth appeared from within the fortress with Leonie on the back of her horse, quickly followed by Ingrid with her Pegasus, Lewin in hand. Her expression frantically searched the bridge for a moment before settling on him and the others, then it cracked with relief. He did his best to smile for her, even though his stomach was still roiling and the dead woman's body burned into his eyes whenever he closed them. "This side of the bridge is secure," Byleth told Rodrigue, who sighed in relief. Judith nodded before turning to face the Empire forces across from them with a steely look of determination. Constance appeared from the fortress next, along with Lysithea, then Happy, then Marianne, then Laurence, each astride their mounts. The rest of their classmates were hurrying to join in. Felix came to a stop between Bernadetta and Dimitri. Despite how stridently he avoided looking at the latter, he'd spent a second searching him for injuries. Dimitri wondered if he'd imagined it, but the little smile on Rodrigue's face suggested he hadn't. Meanwhile Ignatz, Raphael and Flane scrambled to Byleth's other side, the heavy rain soaking their hair to their skin. Glenn skidded to a halt, nearly slipping on the stone. Atra caught him, smiling in faint amusement at his cursing. Would she be able to use her flame sword in this weather dash? Hilda and Balthus brought up the rear, the former cursing and wringing out her hair while the latter was shaking out his blood-stained gauntlets. The rest of the army was still scrambling to form up, a large makeshift hospital resting further back where the victims of the surprise attack were still being cared for by Linhard and Dorothea. "Now we need to secure the rest." "Their air commander is dead," Dimitri said, shifting his grip on Eridbar. "I took care of her." Rodrigue blinked, then took on a knowing look. He walked forward a few steps, ostensibly to get a better look at the scene, but took the chance to squeeze his surrogate son's wrist reassuringly. The red receded from the corners of the young king's eyes just a bit, and he smiled. Ivory, the mirage now fully dissipated, landed right in front of Byleth. Claude sat back in his saddle a bit, balancing Failnaught in front of him. "Their ground commander is dead too," he said with a smirk. "I really should give Gramps something nice when I see him next." Something flickered through his eyes when he said that, something that was gone too fast for Dimitri to interpret. "I'll have to ask him later. They've still got a bunch of demonic beasts and various field commanders, but they're currently in significant disarray." Byleth rolled her shoulder and gave them a smile devoid of happiness. That expression made Dimitri's stomach sink. "I'll never forgive you for draining the happiness from her eyes," he thought, a solemn sadness overshadowing his anger for a brief moment. "I can take care of the demonic beasts," she said mildly. "I thought you'd say that," Claude remarked. A brief frown proved that he'd seen it too. "Constance, use bolting to keep the various field commanders from meeting up and forming any attack plans. Lysithea, keep one eye on Teach, but otherwise just fly overhead and use your discretion. They don't have many archers, and I'll take care of those that are here." His brow furrowed as he examined the battlefield. Behind him, he heard one of Gloucester's retainers lean over to Judith and whisper, "Are we really leaving a teenager to strategize dash?" "Shut up and do what he says," Judith said flatly, one hand on her rapier. "He made the plans that kept Garreg Mach's walls up until we arrived. Hilda and Balthus, you can break open that formation, the battalions will follow in after you. Marianne, stay mobile and help wherever you think you're needed, Ash will cover you. Yuri, cause as much chaos as you can, but don't get in over your head, shadow Atra and Glenn. Ingrid, Sylvain, you and Dimitri take care of any demonic beast that tries to avoid Teach." Claude turned around further and started to say something, stalled, and gave Rodrigue a somewhat embarrassed look. "I'll leave the rest to your discretion," he finished abruptly. Rodrigue just smiled in response before turning and giving Dimitri a pointed look. Abruptly remembering that he was king now, not just the prince, he scrambled to make himself visible before giving his father figure a desperate look. "What's the plan?" he wanted to ask despite not daring to say the words out loud. Thankfully, it was one that could be summed up in a few sentences. "How many of these things does she have?" Sylvain demanded as he ducked under the demonic beast's tail. His horse nickered in alarm, very much not liking being near the unnatural creature. She kept her nerves, however, and carried Sylvain out of the way so Dimitri could make use of the opening in the magic barrier. I suspect neither of us will like the answer to that, Dimitri bit out. Eridbar. Magic surged through the relic. The demonic beast swung its head towards him, bleeding from the holes where its eyes used to be before Ingrid stabbed them out with Lewin, but it didn't react fast enough. He hurtled forward and rammed the lance into its chest. Golden light flares out of the wound in all directions, then the demonic beast exploded. Literally exploded, spraying bones, teeth and claws in every direction while the various chunks of flesh dissolved into black dust. This time, there was no human corpse left behind in the ashes. Eridbar had destroyed it so completely nothing was left but a small, fractured skull. Dimitri spun the lance once and shifted his grip back into a proper ready stance, looking ahead to the troop of mages that had been standing behind the beast, puppeting it. One of them might have passed out just at the sight of him turning their way, or maybe they were hit by an arrow. It wasn't easy to tell with how hard the rain was coming down. He was cold despite the warmth of the heavy fur overcoat he was wearing. His hair was slicked to his skull by the water and the chill was threatening to settle in despite how warmly he was dressed otherwise. Next? He asked sarcastically, pointing Eridbar forward. A number of them broke and ran. The rest, however, abandoned all common sense and charged towards him and Sylvain, throwing fireballs. Well, if we don't want to talk about depressing things, how about a change of subject? Sylvain asked lightly. If he'd been paying more attention, Dimitri probably would have realized he was in trouble. Unfortunately, he was more focused on immediately pressing matters. Is this really the time? Dimitri asked, clutching Sylvain's shoulders as the redhead led his horse in a wide arc to avoid the magical attacks. Ingrid swooped down, slicing one mage's back and scattering the formation before returning to the air. The ground shook as Constance's bolting struck home just over a dozen yards away from them. Right afterwards, a pillar of purple and black light pierced through the rain and haze to swallow up the one demonic beast Byleth hadn't already torn apart. Hades Omega, the most powerful black magic spell ever created. Lysithea was practically invisible thanks to Maia's coloring mixed with the weather. He didn't envy her opponents. A mirage darted overhead, not far from Ingrid, a golden arrow flying from within to strike down an archer that had been taken aim at her. Hey, I think I deserve a medal for waiting as long as I have. Sylvain complained, even as he flipped the lance of ruin around and slammed the butt of the weapon against the back of a mage's head. Jumping down from the horse again, Dimitri spun Eridbar in a circle, slicing half a dozen mages along their backs. The remainder jumped away from him. They attempted to fire spells at him again, but this time he simply swung the relic lance to block the magic. Sylvain charged them again, forcing them to scramble apart. Coming to a stop a few feet away from Dimitri, he blurted out as if he could no longer contain himself, "So about you and Claude Dash." "Really? Really?" Dimitri demanded, before cussing and throwing himself to the ground to avoid a miasma spell from a completely different angle from his current targets. Grabbing a discarded, charred lance off the ground in his other hand, he smoothly turned, straightened up and threw it at the mage who'd attacked him from near the wooden bridge entrance to the main Myrden. When did that happen? How did that happen? Are we really talking about this now? The young king all but screeched, darting forward and bashing one of the mages with the flat side of Eridbar's blade. Clearly if you have your way, we'll never talk about it. Sylvain protested, turning his horse around and clicking his tongue 3 times. Long training kicked in and the mare kicked a mage in the back of the head, sending him sprawling. "Claude? Our Claude? Do you know another Claude?" Dimitri dodged another miasma and swung Eridbar at the mage's leg this time. The blow severed one leg at the knee and knocked the other out from under the man, who fell with a scream. How? When? How? Why? Sylvain fired out rapidly, stabbing the man through the shoulder with the lance and letting her fall to the ground. "Because I love him," Dimitri retorted hotly, half a question and half a hysterical statement of fact, not liking what might have been implied by why enough to momentarily forget how much trouble he'd gone to in order to keep this a secret. Wait, so you're in love? You're actually, seriously in love, and you didn't tell me." Sylvain moaned even as he turned around to face the mounted knights who were approaching them from the wooden bridge that connected to the far entrance to the bridge. I thought we were friends. I didn't tell you because I knew you would do this. How he was having this conversation in the middle of the siege, Dmitri couldn't fathom. The three of us are trying to keep this quiet dash. The three of us? Wait a second, three of us? Sylvain asked, thunderstruck. Dmitri slammed his palm against his forehead, raking them down his face. Oh, I'm in trouble later, he muttered. What? Ingrid swooped down next to him as the mounted knights began to rush towards them. Out of the corner of his eye, Dmitri saw Ingats and Flane fighting off across the field from them. Flane was casting Nosferatu repeatedly while Ignatz protected her, rapidly switching between his rapier and his killer bow. Lawrence blurred past them, casting miasma at a mounted knight, sending him toppling from his mount. Leone was right behind him, firing 2 arrows at a time into the enemy lines that had fallen back to form a defensive line. What was that? Dmitri let out a frustrated noise and grabbed a short spear off of his red-haired friend's saddle. Sylvain, if we survive this, I am going to throw you off this bridge. He informed him furiously, channeling that anger through his arm. He threw the spear at the knight leading the charge. The impact killed his mount and sent the man flying backwards. You've won the hearts of 2 different people, one of whom is Claude, the schemer who keeps everyone at arm's length. Sylvain continued as if he hadn't heard the blonde, leaving the latter quite sincerely pondering carrying out his threat in earnest. And they agreed to share you. What? Ingrid exploded after flying down and having her Pegasus kick another knight off his horse. Dmitri, is that true? Jerk, yes, but we're keeping quiet for now, for good reasons. Please, have mercy on me and keep your mouth shut, Sylvain. Dmitri protested before ducking under a sword strike from the knight that had taken aim at him. Spinning around, he retrieved the short spear he'd thrown earlier and threw it again at the man's back. The impact and crunch made him wince. The man fell of his horse, impaled through the chest. You and Claude, and who? Ingrid demanded. When did this happen? How did I not notice? Sylvain, you will live to regret this day, the young king swore in helpless terror under his blonde friend's intense stare. Eep, was all the redhead could manage. I can't believe I didn't notice this. Ingrid raged, spinning around and venting her frustration at the poor, uninformed mage who for some reason thought that a fire spell would do anything of value to a Pegasus or her rider. She smacked the girl in the face with the flat side of Lewin's blade. You've been smiling so often around Claude, you've spent so much time with him, you've absorbed his sense of humor, you've even picked up his knack for strategy. When did I start losing track of you that badly? How? Without missing a beat, she urged her Pegasus forward and had it slam both its front feet into another mage's face. Who's the third? Don't tell me it's Lawrence, Sylvain begged. What? Dmitri sputtered, slipping on the rain-soaked ground and nearly falling on his face. Scrambling to regain his bearings, he charged after Ingrid to help her with the other mages. Sylvain kept stride with him. Why the hell would you think Lawrence? Oh, thank goodness, I was having very bad mental images of having to entertain him at court for the rest of my life, Sylvain said with a huge sigh of relief. No really, I want to know why your mind went to Lawrence. He must be going mad, to be actively continuing this conversation while they fought. Yet somehow the familiar banter was actually clearing his head, rather than fatally distracting him. There was less pain in his chest and the screaming of the injured or dying wasn't quite so oppressive. Hey, I'm still wrapping my brain around the fact that you went and seduced Claude. It could be literally anyone as far as I can tell. Sylvain protested, then he swung the lance of ruin in a wide arc. The horse that had approached him reared back, throwing its rider. There's no way it's Lawrence. Have you listened to literally any conversation he's had with Claude? Or Dmitri, for that matter? Ingrid asked the redhead incredulously, floating overhead and watching for an unexpected attack. Then she hesitated before uncertainly asking, is it Yuri? He and Claude get along really well. Dmitri's shoulders slumped in defeat. They aren't going to let up, I'm going to be sleeping on the floor for sure. At least Glenn isn't here to make fun of me, oh, I'm just delaying the inevitable. I'd be better served bracing for impact. Well, at least Byleth might find this a bit funny, he said ruefully. The shrill wheeze that Sylvain let out in response was going to be warm memory in the future. Taking the chance to escape, Dimitri darted away from him and Ingrid's high-pitched demands for clarification toward the golden flares of light where Byleth was fighting the remains of the die-hard attackers. Just to make sure she was all right. Chapter 57. A Siege of Fort Mercers. Judith raised one challenging eyebrow at him. It was still distractingly intimidating, though Claude had finally gotten enough confidence to meet it directly rather than gaze over her shoulder. We have the manpower for it, but will our supply train keep up with a protracted siege? It's called the Stubborn Old General for a reason. Unless we do something about it, the Empire will be able to freely marshal troops within and launch another attack on the bridge, Claude countered, smiling even as he contemplated how to sell this idea. Either way, if we want to get to Inver, we have to contend with Mercers sooner or later. Since we know Empire troops are braving the Ogma Mountains to attack Faergus, it's better that we keep up the pressure, or else they'll just reorganize. The Imperial Army has a lot of manpower and can call on more, depending on how well a conscription bill would go over for the masses. I agree, Rodrigue said with a slight frown. We mustn't give Thales and his minions more time to create new devices to bedevil us with. His brow deepened in thought. Theoretically the combined might of the relics could possibly break through the wall. It would be a gamble, however. If we play our cards just right, we might not have to break through the walls at all, Claude responded easily. Turning his attention to Linhard and Dorothea, both of whom were sitting at the War Council at his request, he asked, mostly for the Lord's benefits, "Hey Linhard, you said that during the siege, some Empire soldiers said they were sent by your father to retrieve you. Did they escape or were they taken prisoner?" "They're being held in prisons in Abyss, unless Sir Catherine changed that before leaving to search for Lady Rhea," Linhard answered. "Being my parents' only child, I doubt those special circumstances have lifted just yet. Likely my father asked for a guarantee that I wouldn't be executed in exchange for helping her ascend. He didn't call her Edelgard anymore. Or Hresvelg, or even Emperor. Just she or her." Claude wasn't sure if that was an emotional distancing tactic, or a sign of how betrayed the green-haired boy felt. "Right," Claude clicked his tongue and took a drink of Noah cider. "Would you and Dorothea feel up to a bit of misdirection and sabotage?" Linhard tilted his head to the side. Across from him, sitting between Judith and Dimitri, Byleth blinked twice before her eyes lit up with understanding. "I'm not much of a front-line fighter," Linhard started slowly, before smiling ever so slightly. "So I suppose I was meant for more sneaky roles." "You want the two of us to be decoys?" Dorothea asked uncertainly. "I think you guys, and a number of soldiers dressed in procured Imperial uniforms, can be welcomed right into Fort Mercers without a single suspicious look thrown your way." Claude responded easily, tapping the forest area in front of the fort on the map on the table. "We'll even have a detachment chase you to the gates to sell the illusion better. If you tell them you're trying to get back to your family, well, they can't turn away some good news after the trouble they've been having, can they?" Linhard nodded slowly. "And at night, we can go to the gates and throw them open," he said. "There are 2 sets of entrance gates to Fort Mercers," Claude hummed, pointing to the other gate. "We can split our forces in 2 and cover both of them, take the army inside completely off guard. They'll probably keep an eye on you for the first few days, so play nice and stick close to each other, and remember we won't be far away." "Ignatz can go with you," Byleth mused thoughtfully. "He's an assassin, and he's not as recognizable as some of the other lords. Ash too, now that I think about it. If we can get inside that way, we'd lose far fewer people than if we put the fort to siege," Dimitri said. Claude knew he was quickly warming to the idea. "Will you be alright doing this, Linhard? Dorothea? I know the 2 of you have so far avoided being in the worst of the fighting. If each battle we win is one step closer to the end of this war, I'll manage," Dorothea said quietly. There was a dark shadow over her face. It twisted Claude's heart in a vice, because not everyone was meant to be a warrior, and she'd had any choice in the matter ripped away from her. He hated asking this of her now, putting her in the heart of something so terrible. It really was a sign of how brave and determined a person she was that she volunteered anyway. "It has promise," Rodrigue said after a moment, studying the map. "Do we have any idea what troops are manning Fort Mercers now?" Ingrid and Hannah could lead a Pegasus platoon from above the clouds to run scouting missions, Byleth offered. With seafaring spyglasses, it's an easy job. They would have to fly quite high to avoid any chance of getting spotted, Seath noted. I'd be happy to lead that mission, by your leave, Lady Eisner. Byleth bit her lip briefly before nodding in assent. Still don't like being called that, he thought with a pang of sympathy. I think the squad that would go in with you has to be handpicked, both to ensure your safety and to protect you if things go south. Judith told Linhard. I can think of a few people. So can I, Rodrigue said. Shall we address some specific concerns with this plan in mind? The last time I visited, there were at least 4 ballista within the walls themselves. The War Council went on for another 3 hours. Every area of the plan he had that the others helped him hash out was attacked and examined from every possible angle. A number of deserters from the Imperial Army that had come to the Great Bridge of Murden in the days since their defeat of the invasion force were brought in and asked many questions. As fortune had it, one of them had been posted at Fort Mercers previously and thus provided them with additional, up-to-date information about the fortifications. There were 4 ballista still inside, 2 magical, and the Death Knight was in general command of the forces. Him again, Claude thought sourly. Suthies, I really hope we can do something about him this time, lest he pull another disappearing act. A deep forest surrounded Fort Mercers from the north. After the woods were swept for Imperial scouts, they would make camp within the concealment of the many trees and put the plan into action. First, of course, they would have to travel there. Seath, do you think we've well recovered from the attack a week ago? Claude asked the bishop, who'd been keeping the medical records along with other administrative tasks that he, as a man of church, was trusted to be impartial with. As much as the kingdom and alliance were making friends, old habits died hard. Yes. With some last-minute resupply courtesy of Lord Edmund, we can set out tomorrow morning. Seath said. Not sure if we should push for a quick travel or not. I guess it depends on how resistant the average Imperial is to letting us pass by. Claude mused. Of course, that's something we'll only learn on the road. He had a headache, and he was tired beyond belief. Somehow this was even worse than the conferences he'd dealt with before. The tangible weight of the lives involved in each and every one of their decisions probably had something to do with that. The cider was probably the only thing keeping him sane through these debates, and even then he desperately missed whatever it was his mother did to make her handmade cider taste unique. Fear left an acidic taste in his mouth. He'd always been proud of his plans, only knowing about Divine Pulse and Byleth's use of it had ever shaken his confidence. But that had been in isolated battles, ones with comparatively low stakes. This was war, and now he was gambling Linhard and Dorothea's lives on his belief that the plan would work. If it didn't, those two might well end up in Thales's clutches, not to mention how many of his allies would die in the resulting rout. It's a good plan, kiddo, a voice that sounded like Nader. You can't agonize over the risks, no mortal warrior can plan for all eventualities. You've got a good head for this, trust it. Claude took another drink and tried to ignore his stomach's best efforts to tie itself up in a knot. This is the best option, he reminded himself. Otherwise we have to blockage them in and try to stave them into surrender, all while our people are hammered by the ballista and whatever other over-the-wall tactics they put together. Not to mention the Empire would have more time to plan. Linhard agreed to go. I'll double-check and make sure he and Dorothea don't feel pressured into it. We might have to live off the land once we're deep in Empire territory, he said, half to himself. A supply train can be cut off or even used against us, like the Emperor found out when we set the grass on fire at Gareg Mach. That's awfully risky, Judith mused. We could bring some supplies and take some food from the land as a means of covering our options. But ultimately I think we should put talk of that aside until after we attend to Fort Mercers. If we can hold it, it would make a useful resupply base. True, he hummed, resisting the urge to rub his forehead. Every choice I make feels like I'm flipping a coin. I think I have new respect for you, Pops. Thinking of home left him more anxious than ever to reach the end of this final council at the bridge. Long practice kept his fingers from twitching. Byleth suspected something was on his mind, judging by how she kept sneaking knowing, concerned looks at him. He smiled back at her, hoping he didn't look as wrung out as he felt. She's carrying enough burdens as it is. He wondered how his mother was managing, if she'd gotten his last letter in good time. Freaking out, probably. He didn't envy his father and Nader in their efforts to keep her calm. Mercifully, Byleth gracefully rose from her seat a few minutes later and dismissed them, saying something about having a solid course of action would reassure the army. She was sort of emulating Rhea's posture and tone of voice, semi-successfully at that. She'd gotten better at it, too. The Knights of Sirius watched her with adoration wherever she went. Not that he was thinking very hard on that at this very moment. Instead he bowed to his fellow lords, shot a tired-looking Dmitri an encouraging look, and slipped out of the room. It was a bit harder for him to slip away unnoticed now that he was Lord Regan, the glorious master tactician. He was going to kill the person who gave him that nickname. The army was going to look at him and think that he couldn't make mistakes, and when some of them died, after he almost single-handedly led the army to successfully rout the Empire's surprise attack on the bridge. Now he had random knights and soldiers fretting about his safety, not wanting him to go anywhere alone lest he run afoul with assassins. It was both kind of gratifying to valued and unnerving. But he'd spent years sneaking about and avoiding being seen even when, especially when, honestly, he was being seen. So he walked through the halls, tossing out a joke here and a teasing remark there before slipping into the stairwell that led to the uppermost floor of the tower. The voices grew quiet as he ascended up the steps. A cool breeze blew through the tower, causing him to shiver. These old buildings never were insulated. Every few seconds, he glanced over his shoulder, just to be absolutely certain he wasn't being followed. Not that he imagined anyone would be suspicious of him, but there were still some things about him best kept quiet for the moment. At least for the moment. Soon, very soon, he wouldn't be hiding anymore. The thought sent a chill of anticipation down his spine. The topmost room of the tower was the messenger hawk aviary. Claude let himself in. Again, there was no one there, not a surprise, seeing as the army and the bridge guard were preparing for the march to Fort Mercers. With one final look over his shoulder, he closed the door behind him and walked over to the writer's desk. Sitting down, he removed the letter from his inside coat pocket and reviewed it for the final time. It was elegant in its simplicity. Almirans never minced words, and often derided their Fodlan neighbors' attempts to talk their enemies to death. It better be, anyway. This is my 13th draft. It was a call to arms, a call of war. It spoke of Agartha, how they destroyed the old world before the cataclysm, and how now they were using Edelgard as a pawn to wipe the slate of Fodlan clean, how they would inevitably spread beyond those borders to cleanse the world of inferior humans. Come and fight for the fate of the world. Come and fight for life itself. Khalid's lip twitched upward. What proper Almiran wouldn't find that notion appealing? The addition he added was brief, and addressed solely to his mother. I'm well, and I'm making you and father proud. That would give her more comfort than anything else until she could see him with her own eyes. I can't wait for you to meet Byleth and Dmitri. Blowing on the ink to dry it, Claude folded the letter and placed it in a small black box, beneath a pair of amber earrings he'd bought 2 months ago. Packaging it, he wrote a brief note to his favorite maid back at the Regan estate, in actuality, an old friend of his mother who had been ensuring his letters reached his family in Almira ever since he first came to the Alliance. The note called it a gift for your troubles. She knew what that meant. Once he finished, Claude tied the packaged box with twine and started walking toward the chirping hawks that were waiting in their cages. He hesitated, briefly. Last chance to back out, Prince Ealing. There was still a good chance that this choice could backfire on him. It could be too much for people of Fodlan to acknowledge that an Almiran prince was one of their own as well. But after a moment, those fears passed. Seeing friendship and camaraderie forged in fire between people who had been divided and bitter toward each other for literal centuries had sparked a realization: if war was the great equalizer, and they all faced the same foe in the form of Agartha, because why would they tolerate Almira or Brigid or Dada and their inferior humans any more than those who lived in Fodlan? Then this was as good a chance as he would ever get to make it plain how little difference there truly was between both sides of his heritage. And they would need the largest army raised in Fodlan's history in order to storm Shambhala proper. Claude grimaced as he remembered some of the details that Atra had given them, along with the knowledge that there was likely more that they couldn't account for since Atra wouldn't have been privy to them. If not now, then when? He opened the nearest cage. The hawk fluttered to the nearest perch, chirping in delight at the thought of getting to fly. "Hey there, you look like you're dying to stretch your wings." The hawk chirped again, flapping its wings as he carefully tied the small box to its foot. "It's very light, I promise." Taking the bird on his arm, he moved to the window, opened it, and urged the bird into flight. The hawk took off, quickly vanishing into the horizon. Claude let out a long breath as he tracked its flight until it was no longer possible. Here goes nothing. A strange mix of feelings sat in his chest, wrestling for supremacy. He bit his lip for a moment, then headed back to the stairs with a small half-smile. "Well, whatever happens next, at least I won't live my whole life denying who I am. Sylvain, I would love to know why you've been staring a hole in the back of my head for the last 3 days." Claude said blandly, pretending to be fully absorbed in adjusting Ivory's saddle and not paying any mind to the redhead in the stall across from him. "My hair isn't that much of a mess yet, is it? We can't exactly bring luxuries out on a war trail." "Oh, no reason," Sylvain said with terrible false casualness. Claude snorted and dryly said, "I'm flattered by the attention, but you're not my type. Better luck elsewhere, you valiant romantic, but you're used to hearing that by now, right?" Sylvain made a strangled choking sound. Claude twisted slightly to look over his shoulder at the redhead. Yup, he was gaping at him. At least he was keeping his mouth shut, mostly. The brunette had very much not appreciated Ingrid dragging him off after the victory dinner, cornering him in a tower and demanding to know his intentions toward Dimitri. That had been a very awkward, very scary conversation, because she'd also known about Byleth. Needless to say, Dimitri instantly threw his old friend under the wyvern pack when asked. Unfortunately, the various ways he might have gained retribution on the loud-mouthed womanizer could be potentially misconstrued in a war camp, so he'd have to settle for glaring. At least Dida doesn't know yet. Hopefully. I think one horribly long, awkward, and uncomfortable conversation where I fight to convince a fair Gus noble that I'm not stringing either of my future spouses along, and, in fact, intend to do right by both of them, is enough for me. Claude wasn't as annoyed with Dimitri for slipping up as he would have been otherwise. He was now keenly aware of how fragile his king's emotions were in the heat of battle. Frankly, being distracted by Sylvain's probing into his love life was preferable to his slipping into a manic state where he sought the blood of his enemies at the expense of all reason and potentially his own life. Byleth was frazzled and slightly panicky, however, and that was just unacceptable. She fretted about rumors spreading and the effect it could have on how the army perceived them, as if she wasn't racking her mind about enough already. He fully intended to needle and annoy Sylvain as much as possible in retaliation. "There's a good joke," Ash said dryly. Claude let out a startled laugh while Sylvain sputtered in protest. "When Ash is making fun of you, you know you've made it easy. We're going to be marching across Gronder Field, right? That's where the Battle of the Eagle and Lion was held." There was a wistful note in the other boy's voice. With a sympathetic sigh, Claude reached over and ruffled his hair. Ash squawked but didn't pull away from the affectionate gesture. "It's the fastest route. We won't be lingering there long." "Right," Ash murmured. His horse nickered and nuzzled his shoulder, as if sensing his low mood. The silver-haired boy chuckled and patted his neck. "I know, boy. Thanks. Sleep well last night, Ash?" "You look better than yesterday," Claude asked, examining his friend's face. The shadows under Ash's eyes, which had been pretty bad after the battle on the bridge, were much less pronounced now. Ash blushed, looked everywhere except at him, and nodded semi-frantically. "Why yeah. Marianne made me a sleep-inducer, and it helped a lot." "Is that right?" Claude asked teasingly. "Why yes, of course," Ash protested, pressing his hand against his chest. Claude casually caught his wrist when he moved to mount his horse and tilted his hand. There was a small silver ring on the boy's finger, studded with a single sapphire. Seeing this, the brunette grinned at him, patted him on the head, and winked. Ash's blush deepened. He pressed against his horse's side as if hoping he would disappear. "Heh, I'm just teasing. You're too sweet to get up to anything nefarious," Claude joked, letting go of his hand. "If the two of them did anything more than cuddle last night, I'd be very surprised." "Clay-odd," Ash whined in protest. He did smile though, which was a relief. "Be nice to Ash, Claude. Marianne said quietly as she led Dort past them. Her eyes sparkled with warmth nevertheless. Ash smiled shyly at her. "I'm always nice. Aren't I, Teach?" he protested, turning to his darling professor who had walked up behind them. "Do you really want me to answer that?" Byleth asked teasingly. He pouted at her while Ash, Marianne, and Sylvain got to laugh at his expense. "Hello, Ivory. How do you feel about carrying me as well today?" Ivory thrashed her tail and stretched her neck forward to nuzzle Byleth's raised hand. She'd very quickly decided she liked Teach, becoming almost as possessive of her as she was of Claude himself. She often sulked when she spotted her riding alone or with someone other than Dimitri. "You're so sweet," Byleth cooed, scratching behind her horns. Claude snorted. "She's all sweetness when you're around, wait until you've found her when her dinner is late." Ivory growled and clawed at the floor. "Oh, don't give me that. You're a brat, I love you, but you're a brat." Byleth's smile took a mischievous edge. "No wonder you two bonded so easily." "Oh, Kman." He whined in protest. Her free hand snaked over and grasped his wrist, lovingly rubbing her thumb against his palm. "That's no fair. And I'm letting you share Ivory and everything." Nevertheless, he led her into the stall and helped her into the saddle. The rain had let up and the clouds cleared after 2 days of violent storms. The sun beamed down on them, warming his skin as Ivory took to the air. As she often did during marches, she didn't rise too far from the ground so he could keep line of sight with the army columns, but was high up enough that he could have a quiet conversation with Byleth without the fear of being overhead. "I sent the letter," he told her quietly. Byleth twitched slightly. He could see the thoughtful look on her face, even though she was leaning back against his chest and gazing ahead. "When do you think they'll get it?" "Not for a month and a half, at the very least. There's a lot of distance to cover, after all. We might be in the Inver by then. Who will receive them if they move into the Alliance while you're away?" "Gramps." He felt Byleth tense up. "Your grandfather will." "I had a chance to see him, when we traveled through the edge of the Regan lands." "Your grandfather is there." "Please, my lord, follow me." It wasn't really a question. It still startled the hell out of Claude. He spun around and stared disbelievingly at the retainer who'd always been at his grandfather's side. The man was old as well, and wouldn't be joining them on the front lines, instead remaining behind to keep order at home. "You brought Gramps here?" he said, unable to hide his incredulity. "He's not healthy enough to travel." Nevertheless, he insisted. "Please come with me," the man repeated. He looked tired, more so than the brunette had ever seen him before. Too stunned to do anything else, Claude trotted after him up the stairs of the massive hotel his column of the army was staying in. There were plenty of guards, at least, they weren't taking what little health his grandfather had left for granted. The retainer stood by the door to the suite and gestured for him to enter. Biting his lip, Claude opened the door and walked inside. "What are you doing, Gramps? You know this is too much for you now," he thought as he gazed at the soul-prone figure within the elegant room's confines. Henry von Regan was lying in bed, looking up at the ceiling. His color was gray, he looked all his 78 years and more besides. Yet when the door opened, he said in a still strong voice, "Come and sit, Khalid." Claude did not come and sit. He was too stunned to do anything but stand there, the doorknob slipping from his fingers and causing the door to slam shut behind him. What did you just call me?" he asked in disbelief. "I can't have heard that right." "Did he just?" "You heard me well enough. Your keen ears that catch so many secrets have not suddenly failed you, have they?" Henry broke into a rough coughing fit after speaking these words. The tremors shook his entire body, pain radiated at every sound. Rocking back on his heels, Claude hurried to his bedside and grabbed a water jug, pouring out a glass. Carefully he slid his hand underneath his grandfather's head and lifted it so he could drink from the mug without choking. "That sounds worse than last I remember," he noted very distantly. "You don't have much time left, do you, Gramps? Where'd you find that shield you sent me?" he asked in an attempt to buy himself time to organize his thoughts. "It saved my hide a few times during the siege. It was lost in some old family vault, I had it dug up," Henry said dismissively as Claude settled him back on the bed. May it serve you well in the battles to come, Khalid, and whatever struggles follow in their aftermath. You have never called by that name before. Ever. You'd done anything you could to avoid acknowledging my father. Henry cleared his throat, coughing with less violence and closing his eyes. Claude automatically laid a hand on his forehead, wincing at the heat he could feel radiating off the old man's skin. They told me you were the one who devised the defense of the monastery, and crippled the Empire's supplies with one of your plans. Remarkable, for such a young man. I've grown a lot, Claude responded uncertainly, soaking a cloth in a bowl of cold water and spreading it over Henry's forehead. Thank you, the old man sighed. Agartha, Khalid, Agartha. I had never felt old until you told me of them and the girl who left them to save us. Is she here? Claude nodded. She's been on my mind much. Her conscience bade her to abandon all that she was taught to be good and just in the world to save those that were beneath her. He snorted. Perhaps it is the young who are wise, and we old fools are the ones clinging to hate and weakness. Gramps, are you all right? You well know the answer to that, Henry said, turning his faded green eyes towards his grandson. The girl came here for her conscience. What made you value your old fool of a grandfather and his home? Why should the two parts of who I am divide me? Claude asked, finally speaking the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind ever since he was a child. Henry gazed back at him, his eyes intense despite their milky color. Win this war, Khalid. Not just by defeating your enemy, but by tearing up the roots that made it possible. If you must send messages beyond our lands to make this possible, I'll see them gone away. Claude's throat was too tight to speak. He could only nod, gently brushing his grandfather's hair away from his face. You're burning up, Gramps. He managed after a painfully long moment. Please tell me your physician came with you. Did he meet Atra while we were there? She slipped off after dinner. Byleth asked. Yeah. I brought her up to visit him after he was made a little more comfortable. I waited outside while they were talking. She spent at least an hour with him. Claude glanced down at the ground, searching for the renegade who was riding with Yuri. She looked really thoughtful, for lack of a better word, when she finally left. How are you feeling? I don't know what I'm feeling right at this second. Claude felt a hard lump forming in his throat, and the corners of his eyes burned. I might end up ranting and cursing and generally losing it in the not-too-distant future, though. We'll be there for you, Byleth promised him quietly, tilting her head and kissing his jaw. Thank you. Claude felt a tear drip down his cheek and did his best to blink it away. If they were going to call him the Master Tactician, he should at least look the part, right? Chapter 58. Are you sure about this, Linhard, Dorothea? This is your last chance to back out. I know, Professor. Linhard had changed from the kingdom-style outfit he'd favored since leaving Gareg Mach into a tattered overcoat and his school uniform. His hair was dirty and in disarray, and he'd deliberately gone for a roll in the mud to sell the idea that he'd been on the run for several days. Dorothea had done the same to a lesser extent. There were leaves and twigs caught up in the tangles of her long hair, there was dirt under her nails, and her songstress outfit, which she'd been so proud of, was ripped in multiple places. Seeing them like this sent sparks of anxiety through Byleth's stomach. If the Empire found out about their plan and imprisoned them, they'd probably look much worse when she finally managed to reach them again, if she could even reach them. We've given it a lot of thought, Dorothea put in. It's the only plan that'll get us into Fort Mercers without a siege. If all goes well, we'll be able to take it in a single day without losing too many people. A dark shadow fell over her face, a familiar one, too. Despite the fact that she generally stuck to acting as a medic and didn't fight unless enemies got close, war was taking a toll on her. That makes it worth the risk. I've yet to see a plan of Claude's fail, Linhard said calmly, his light tone ill-matched with his solemn expression. My father wants me back, so I can't see any reason that we'd be discovered before the army got inside. Try not to worry too much about us, okay? He actually smiled at her after saying that, a faint smile, but a real one. Her chest tightening, Byleth stepped forward and enveloped him in a hug for a lingering moment before doing the same to Dorothea. I'm so proud of you two, and I'm so scared. Be careful. Never let your guard down. We won't. "We'll take good care of them, your worship," one of the 20 Empire deserters promised. Each of them was highly devout, and between Edelgard's persecution of their faith and the violence of war, they'd defected to join the Knights of Sirios. Byleth was a bit nervous trusting them with her precious students nonetheless, so she'd mixed a few unassuming knights that Seath had directed to serve her specifically. "No harm will come to them as long as we draw breath." "That's reassuring," Byleth said. It was only partially a lie. She doubted anything would soothe her anxiety until she found them unharmed after they stormed the fort. "Be sure to stay together once inside, don't let them separate you. Remember to pretend to be amiable with any guards they assign you for a little while before attempting to give them the slip." "Claude and Flane provided me with sleeping drafts," Dorothea said, revealing a number of vials from one of her dress's deep pockets for emphasis. "They'll take care of any guards we're assigned. We'll open the gates on the third day, right?" "Yes, the third day." Those 48 hours were going to be pure torture on her nerves, Beelth just knew it. "I suppose there's no other advice I can offer that isn't blatantly obvious. Prepare to be chased, some of the archers will loose arrows, but they'll be aiming to miss, so don't panic, all right?" "It's all according to plan." Linhard and Dorothea nodded. "We'll see you soon, Professor," the green-haired boy promised. Then the two of them turned and began to make their way through the trees, the Empire deserters at their heels. Byleth watched them until the thick brush and forestry rendered it impossible to see them. "You think they'll be suspected?" Happy's voice startled her. She nearly jumped out of her skin before turning to face him. She was staring ahead into the trees, her eyes tracking as though still seeking Linhard's back. They'd spent a lot of time together. She often found them sitting together, Linhard rambling about this and that while Happy's dry observations bounced right off his snark-proof hide. They did refuse to join Edel and her mutt when she first demanded their alliance. Claude coached them for what questions he expected to be tossed their way, Byleth said, breathing out slowly. "I think these people will buy that they just too frightened of war to initially join up, but were eventually swayed by their loyalty to the homeland. Linhard is also protected by his parents' desire to see him brought home. It's not that I don't trust Coyote to do his best to cover our bases," Happy said. Claude really liked her nickname for him. Dimitri was a little less enthused by the less comparatively intimidating Diddy, but he's been caught off guard by the behavior of the Empire before. "Not even the wisest can see all ends," Byleth said quietly. "Have faith in everyone, Happy. We'll do the best we can." "Faith, huh?" Happy echoed, looking up at the sky. "After I got dragged all over and stuck in abyss for something that was done to me, I didn't have much use for faith. But that was before I met you and the world got weird. Not sure I remember how to have faith." Hesitantly, Byleth reached out and clasped her hand reassuringly. The redhead hummed, still looking into the trees in the hopes of catching one more glimpse of her close friend before he fully embarked on this dangerous gamble. "Faith is unique to everyone. I think if you look deep enough within, you'll figure out your faith. You must have some, because you chose to follow me out into this mess rather than stay in abyss." Happy smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess I did do that, didn't I?" She finally tore her eyes away from the treeline and turned to face her fully. "I thought that was just trust, but maybe there's overlap between those two words." Byleth nodded. Shouts and artificial sounds of combat started to drift between the trees. Sighing heavily, she said, "We better pull back, just to be absolutely safe." Happy's smile fell, but nodded in understanding nonetheless. The two of them turned and began to walk back to camp, an unspoken nervousness hanging in the air between them. "How will we know if they've made it and they've achieved their goal?" the redhead asked. "There will be a light signal from the battlements," Byleth answered. "The pursuing units will linger in tree cover after Linhard and the others escape, and will return once they've seen it." "Makes sense." It took them roughly 15 minutes to return to camp. It was a testament to how dense this forest was that she couldn't see half the army with all the bushes, low-hanging tree branches and other foliage in the way. Rodrigue, Judith, and Seath were at the front camp waiting for her return. They relaxed when they stepped into the clearing. "The decoys are away," she said with what she hoped was solid confidence. She felt very tired all of a sudden. "Then now there's nothing to do but wait," Rodrigue said. He put a hand on her shoulder and smiled kindly at her. "With that in mind, I suggest we retire for now. It's been a long march. She couldn't help but give him a grateful look. I suppose a father with 3 children would be better able to tell when someone's hiding their feelings in an effort to look stronger. Judith had a knowing spark in her eyes, but she didn't object and neither did Seath. She didn't have to go very far to find her students. They were sitting in a ring around a coal pit, weapons and other equipment set aside, talking in low voices. Dmitri glanced up and brightened when he spotted her, waving for her to join him and take the empty place next to him on the log he'd been sitting on. So Linhard and Dorothea have gone off, Bernadetta murmured once she'd settled, worry heavy in her voice. She was sitting between Claude and Yuri, a sewing project sitting in her lap. It looked like a half-finished dragon, disarmingly cute with light blue and white fabric. She was probably more worried than anyone else aside from Happy or Byleth herself. She had been in class with them for 3 months, and Dorothea stayed a close friend of hers even after she transferred. They're not alone, Byleth said to reassure her, before lightly switching the subject. Is that the Immaculate One, Bern? Bernadetta blushed and ducked her head a bit, putting both her hands over her creation. And not really. I'm just using my memory of it as a base for my own design. I mean, it was so beautiful and majestic, I couldn't help myself. It's going to be adorably scary when it's done, Claude said cheerily, ruffling her hair. Bernadetta squeaked and half-ducked, half-hid under his arm, across the coal pit from her. Felix jerked like was going to say something but stopped himself. Glenn, who was sitting next to Ingrid a few feet away, smirked knowingly at him. Felix seemed to sense this because he snapped his head over to his brother and scowled. Felix is jealous. Are his feelings for her brotherly or romantic? You need to ask, Suthies giggled lightly. I think you ought to remind him that even the greatest of thieves can steal nothing with silence. I wonder what's holding him back. He'd never been one to hold back when vocalizing his feelings. Confessing one's heart desire is different than calling someone an idiot, as you well know, her friend responded, a teasing note in her voice. Byleth felt herself blush lightly and dropped her hand on top of Dimitri's. She felt her king lean a little more on her shoulder, transmitting affection through the subtle touch. Very funny, she grumbled without much bite. Is that your oh-so-subtle encouragement that I go and give him a nudge? Oh, like you weren't already thinking of doing that. The joke, and correct observation, lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. What do you mean, adorably scary? Bern's toys are always adorable, Hilda pouted. She was holding another doll in her hands that had been made by the diminutive Archer. This one was a bear, pink and white and sporting a subtle heart design on its back leg. She mimed moving its front limbs in a hugging gesture, earning a chuckle from Balthus. You and I might have very different definitions of adorable, Yuri teased. Bernadetta pouted up at him, rather than wilting in the slightest. The changes that had come over her since her transfer to the Golden Deer family were in turn subtle and outgoing. She was so much stronger now, so full of determination. Even in the moments where she was still shy and anxious, she didn't tremble or collapse quite so completely as before. Yuri softened around her, looking at them sitting together. You'd be forgiven for believing they were cousins or even half-siblings with the ease and affection between them. Claude was the same, in my mind. Byleth thought of him as the middle sibling, a medium between a cynical older brother and a shy little sister. Maybe Felix hasn't said anything because he doesn't think either Yuri or Claude would approve of him, she thought semi-jokingly. Since when has Felix Frildarius ever let other people's opinions affect his bullheaded determination to chase after what he wanted? Suthies asked in response. Has he ever been in love before? Byleth wondered. In my experience, that changes everything. Suthies pondered that. Perhaps that is what's pinning his tongue to the roof of his mouth. He may well need a nudge to make any sort of real move. It keeps me calm, Bernadetta said when she came back to Fodlan. The purple-haired girl ducked her head slightly. They say that my father was put under house arrest after Edelgard ascended the throne, but what if that's just a rumor? She shuddered. Once we get to Inver, I'm going to have to see him again. Claude's expression flattened, green eyes flashing with anger. You don't have to see him if you don't want to. We can deal with him. Felix frowned at that. What's this about Bernadetta's father? Yuri snorted. Don't call that man by a title he never earned. He's not likely to be a concern, given that his wife replaced him after he got locked up. Rather than accept that, Felix's frown deepened, his eyes flickering to Bernadetta. Not wanting her anxious friend to have to talk about her past in front of everyone, Byleth interjected. Let's not worry about Inver until we're actually close to it. Even once we capture Fort Mercers, there's still quite a ways to go before we reach it. Especially if we hope to do something about Brigid. Constance tilted her head. What can we do about Brigid without being able to deliver Petra safely to them? She inquired. Her grandfather has no other heirs. What could we offer them that would be more desirable than the safe return of the last of his family? But at the same time, we don't want to have conflict with them. Mercedes said, sadness flickering across her expression at the thought. There's no reason for us to fight. Any lives lost in battles between us are lost in vain. Yuri leaned forward a bit, scowling slightly. I haven't heard from my various rouges in the Empire since before the attack on the bridge, but word on the street is that Petra isn't particularly enthused about fighting us. I've sent word around to ensure everyone's looking for her and listening for where she and the people of Brigid who'd been summoned to her side are being deployed. Thank you, Yuri. Byleth bit her lip. We ought to pay them for their troubles once we get there. Our best case scenario, we separate her from her Imperial handlers and deliver her safely back to Brigid. At least we can send a promise to the king that if we catch her, we'll return her to him unharmed. Either way, we'll be marching east across Empire lands after this. Will we going near Lake Tet Arus? Leonie asked, a curious look in her eyes. I heard that there's an old treasure that once belonged to Saint Indek there. If we're passing by, maybe we should go in and see if something really is there. Is that really wise? Ash asked uncertainly, a distinct hint of nervousness in his voice. There are a lot of stories about treasure hunters and glory seekers going into that lake and never being seen again. Greedy gravediggers entering a sacred land and never coming out. My, I wonder why that might have been, Constance said with a semi-mocking laugh. I don't know if we'll go near the lake, but if we do, I'll ask Seath. Perhaps if Lady Rhea escaped capture at the Empire's hands, she fled to a sacred location such as that to hide. Byleth dearly hoped it was so. She wanted to see Rhea again, she wanted to ask her questions, to find out if she was leading people the way the older woman perceived her to be capable of. She just wanted to know if the closest she'd ever had to a mother figure was alive and well. Ugh, enough serious talk for now. Hilda cried, pumped her arms. We're all together, why don't we play a game? Let's pass the time doing something fun. Marianne perked up slightly. She was toying lightly with a ring that she most certainly had not been wearing before they left the Bridge of Myrddin. Byleth wondered how it was that Hilda hadn't noticed it yet. She was usually completely on top of her best friend's moods. And there was no way Hilda wouldn't drop everything to throw a party over Marianne getting engaged, war or no war. Even if it was an eloping, the pinkette would be vibrating and bouncing off the walls with excitement. It was a testament to how distracted they all were, she supposed. They played games until the sun set, some board games Sylvain had stuck in his travel bag, others word play, or guessing games. Their spirits somewhat buoyed by this familiar and affectionate byplay, the former students retreated to their various tents and did their best to go to sleep. Byleth, waiting until most were asleep, crept her way to Dimitri and joined him on his futon. Sleeping next to her seemed to do much to keep his nightmares at bay. Her own dreams, however, proved to be less easily swayed. Earth-shaking explosions seemed to rattle the very foundations of the earth. She was nearly pitched forward onto her face, catching herself on a pillar at the last moment. Blinking furiously, Byleth found herself standing in the middle of Garreg Mach's entrance hall. It took a moment for her to recognize it, because none of the symbols of Sirios or the Three Kingdoms were hung from its rafters. Them again, she said, except it was Suthi's voice that passed through her lips. After all the destruction they've already wrought, they're still bent on killing the few that still remain. Worried voices erupted from behind her, people talking on top of each other like frantic ducklings. She wasn't even given the chance to try and reassure them before the double doors burst open. Grandmother! Grandmother! A boy dressed in odd white and gold clothes, who looked to be about 12-13, ran through the opening with a 3-year-old girl under one arm. He had light green hair and bright green eyes, he spun on his heel and threw aura at some unseen pursuer as a dozen other people in similar outfits scrambled in after him. There are more refugees out there. They're coming over the hills. Lien. An older male voice burst from behind her, shock, relief and pure parental anger pouring from each syllable. As Byleth, Suthies, hurried down the stairs to reach him, she was outpaced by a man in his early 20s who crossed the distance between them in an instant, crashing to his knees in front of the boy and examining him frantically. Lien, what are you doing? Where is your mother? Why are you running around out there when those missiles are being thrown around? The young man had the same green hair and eyes that she had now, that Suthies had. He wore black and gold, and there was a sword buckled at his hip. Leaving the scolding to him, Byleth urged the bloody, filthy, desperate people to come to her, hands outstretched and glowing softly with healing magic. Mom is helping the others people come over the ridge. She sent me ahead with these people, the others are too weak to run. Lien said indigently. He puffed up his chest, only to panic when the little girl he was holding started to cry. He held her carefully and tried to rock her back to sleep. McCule, Byleth, Suthies, said chidingly as the young man drew in a deep breath, no doubt for an extended scolding. Your son has been very brave, let us go and ensure that Izhame and those under her protection can reach this place safely too. Saint McCule's jaw clicked shut as his priorities overcame his initial panic, or perhaps just redirected it at the reminder that his wife was outside in that war zone. All right, mother. He scrambled to his feet and looked over his shoulder. Indek. Do you think you need to ask? Another chiding voice interrupted. Another young man with light green hair appeared from behind them, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. He had a simple bow strapped over his shoulder. He wore casual leather and a smile that faintly reminded her of Claude. He took a moment to ruffle his nephew's hair. Let's go. Angharad, help our brave little Lien care for these people until we're back, all right. Of course, a female voice chided from somewhere behind them. Now get going. Trusting her daughter, to ease the pain and fear that had stalked these desperate humans for so long, Byleth hurried out of the double doors on McCule and Indeka's heels. The sight outside was pure madness. The forest was burning, dotting the hills in all directions were massive stone figures firing massive blasts of red magic at each other. The sky was full of poisonous smoke, stone and steel birds swooped in and out of the suffocating blanket blocking out the moon, crashing into each other or grabbing vehicles from the ground and throwing them miles away to be dashed into pieces. Flames licked the sky itself, the smell of death was pervasive, even mingled with the poison gas and dirt. Insults, death threats, and curses flew through the air, transmitted through familiar frequencies. Below these hulking death machines, highlighted by the greedy flames, were many tiny figures scrambling towards them while avoiding the death raining from above. A star fell from the sky and hit the ground far behind them. The ground shook violently again, stone and metal flew up like a volcano had erupted. Snarling with anger, Byleth realized that two of the stone war machines were turning towards the group of haggard civilians fleeing the battlefield, and that was not acceptable. McCule and Indek both transformed in response to the sight, taking to the air. The two dragons, each in their own unique forms, launched themselves at the golems, breathing pure magic beams that pierced through and obliterated each in two devastating blows. Pushing her magic into her back, Byleth felt her wings manifest. She crossed the grass in a blur until she landed in front of the refugees fleeing from this terrible, pointless war that Agartha and Laputa had started. Mother! Izhame cried in relief, holding out a small child to her. Byleth snarled when the smell of that poisonous radiation hit the roof of her mouth as she leaned over that poor boy. The human girl who'd won her son's heart was bleeding from her feet, her arms, and her back, yet the indomitable spirit in her eyes was undimmed. Please, they've all been irradiated, I can't dash. Say no more, Byleth said as reassuringly as she could, holding both her hands over the little boy and pushing healing magic through his entire body. Ridding mortal bodies of radiation was trying, taking twice as much magic as normal wounds. But it could be done, she could do it, and she had taught Angharad and Artemis to do the same. The boy began to cry seconds later. Izhame nearly collapsed in relief and pain. McCule's furious roar echoed over the grounds as he attacked another golem that had turned its pitiless eyes towards those fleeing to the only neutral land left in this world. Byleth quickly gave Izhame and the refugees a quick fix heal and said, quickly, my family awaits. There are only a few yards to safety, run as fast as you can. We will protect you. Everyone, to the monastery. Izhame cried, her voice a rally to the others. A ragged cry of hope and relief echoed from Smoky, rough throats. Hurry. We'll only be in the way out here. Byleth rose to the air, feeling her body shifting shape as she did so. Indek was circling around his brother who had taken a hit, blasting away at the golems who seemed to resent their intrusion on the bloody grudge match. Keeping her back to her fleeing humans, Byleth rose higher up to the sky, keeping one eye on her boys as one eye trained on the sky. Sure enough, more of those missiles had been launched from both sides. They will poison the whole world at this rate. No living thing will be able to call these ruins home, and yet they still persist with this madness. Her heart twisted with anger and grief, the thought of what she might have to do sitting heavily upon her. No. No more of this today. She reached into the vast wells of her power and breathed out. A blinding blast of starlight burst from her throat, tearing through the missiles and detonating them far above their targets. She guided the beam as she turned, taking out dozens in a single swing. She flew above the toxic miasma and swept her wings outward with a grunt of exertion. It blew the clouds away. She couldn't purify the air now, she didn't have the time. She had to ensure the humans free of the madness that had claimed the two kingdoms of this world reached safety before she forced these armies to disperse. Thankfully they were making good time despite how exhausted they must have been and how long they had been running. She was keenly aware that the monastery was starting to run short on room with the hundreds, bordering on thousands, who were already hiding within. Once they were through those doors, however, she decided with determination that since they had brought their war to her doorstep, she had no choice but to voice her opinions on this matter now. Cease this useless fighting. You have brought war to my doorstep, in violation of my warning that I would tolerate no violence within my domain. Leave, and take your poison with you. Leave and tell your masters that if war returns to this place again, I will not be so merciful. And she unleashed a wave of her power, not enough to destroy them, but enough to get her point across. It sent both sides reeling. Indek and McCule, confident that this was the end of the matter, retreated back to check on the refugees. She would linger long enough to make sure they dispersed, then return and do the same. Angharad had everything in hard, she knew, but it would give the humans who'd fled unimaginable horror some peace of mind to see her ensure their comfort. The last missile exploded, blindingly white in the sky below. Byleth gasped, a spasm racking her muscles as she jerked with wakefulness. She scrambled up into a sitting position, her fingers groping with the blanket that had been twisted around her in all her tossing and turning. Her blood was racing, the images from the dream were so intense she could still see them as she blinked, the torches and first rays of dawn not enough to drive them away. What was that? Suthi's voice made Byleth start. It was shaky. The last time she'd spoken with such uncertainty and unease was, that night in the Holy Mausoleum. I think it was one of my memories, from the ending of the world. That scene there. Byleth bit her lip very hard, her foggy mind pawing at the details and the various moments. Those things, were those Titanis? The way Atra described them, it's almost a perfect fit. I suppose they must be. McCule, Indek, Lien. The saints. The realization hit her like an avalanche when her mind woke up a bit more, and she recalled what she, Suthi's, had said to them. The saints, they were your children. There was another name, another mentioned, an Angharad? Artemis? Was she remembering that right? Lien called your grandmother. She could see his face clearly in her mind, sweet and soft and full of bright innocence, wind-swept curly green hair falling around his high cheeks. None of the scriptures had mentioned McCule having a son, had they? She racked her brain, trying to remember, but everything was coming up blank. Why wasn't there any record of him having a son? Why had Lien slipped through the cracks of history, instead of heading a family the way Sethlin had? What happened to Lien and Izhame? Or Angharad? Suthi's keened, the noise nearly making Byleth jumped out of her skin. She'd never heard her goddess and friend sound so completely distressed. In her mind's eye, she saw Suthi's draw into herself, wrapping her arms around her chest. Making a small distressed noise of her own, Byleth did what Suthies had done for her many times now. She sent a phantom hug and as much reassurance as she could muster while her head was still spinning from her intense dream. Byleth. Dimitri's soft voice distracted her slightly. He opened one eye and looked up at her. When he saw her expression, his face softened with concern and he scrambled to sit up himself. He pressed a soft kiss on her bare shoulder and gave him an imploring look. "What's wrong?" I had this dream." In halting tones, still devoting some of her concentration to comforting a distressed Suthies, Byleth explained the memory as best she could to him. Dimitri's eyes grew very wide across her explanation, and by the time she finished he looked just about as shaken. The saints were Suthies' children. The young king breathed, his blue eyes wide as plates. That, how could the church have no record of that? If Indek and Makul both were, would not Sirios, Sikal, and Sethline been as well? "I'm beginning to think that Claude is more right than he knows," Byleth admitted, her throat feeling dry. "Someone, whoever wrote the scriptures, deliberately left out information about the very goddess the religion worships. This is more than just a few omissions here and there, it left out the reason for the cataclysm and certain particulars of Suthies' relationship with humanity. It goes against everything I know to say this, but the wholesale exclusion of Agartha from the scriptures is beginning to seem almost sinister." Dimitri murmured. "Perhaps the nature of the great cataclysm is the root cause of them being forgotten, but I wouldn't rule it out, yet." Claude's cynicism is rubbing off on me." Byleth pressed her hand against her face, propping her elbow up on her knee. "I didn't see Sirios in that dream. I wonder if I'll see another memory next I fall asleep. Has this ever happened before?" "Once. When we were chasing after the chalice. But that was the only time. Now that I think about it, I must have been witnessing Suthies healing the world after the cataclysm. After that, I didn't have another dream like it until now. Perhaps it's because you've taken on Suthies' heart. Maybe." Byleth's fingers dug into her temple, a hiss of frustration blowing out between her teeth. "I saw my children," Suthies murmured, her voice a little steadier but still plaintive. "What happened to my children? I went to sleep, then there was pain, and then I woke up with you. What happened to my children? We'll find out, Suthies. I promise. I don't think I'm going to fall asleep anytime soon," she murmured. Dimitri ran his hand down her back. She sighed and leaned into his touch, letting it drain away some of her distraction. "Then don't," he said. "Dress and get some fresh air, my beloved. I'll join you shortly. You're sure you shouldn't get more sleep?" "I'm more rested than I've been in a while, don't worry about me." Accepting that for what it was, she hadn't been woken in the night by him shaking and sobbing in his sleep. After all, Byleth carefully dressed and put her shoes on. Then she carefully opened the tent and slipped out, walking through the trees and brush in order to avoid looking like she'd slept next to Dimitri. A good idea, since she wasn't the only person awake. Aside from the camp guards, Yuri and a few knights she sort of recognized were sitting by a campfire, making small talk. As she came closer, she realized with a start that these were the men who'd been chasing Linhard, Dorothea, and their backup into Fort Mercers. Yuri saw her out of the corner of his eye and turned to wave her over. Knowing what was on her mind, he mouthed out, "The plan is progressing smoothly," as she came and sat next to him on the log he'd procured. A dizzying rush of relief washed over Byleth. She knew that the knights wouldn't have been able to tell if her students had been received with suspicion. This strongly suggested that they had taken the bait. All they had to do was wait, lull the guard into a sense of security, then Linhard would strike. Tomorrow they would move their camp closer. The day after that, the next battle of the war. "Be careful in there, my friends. Please, please be careful. You're sleeping with the enemy within those walls, don't lose heart. Care to join our game of cards, Professor?" Yuri gave her a self-deprecating smile when the other knights frowned at him. "Sorry, I really should be calling you Lady Eisner, but it just feels so strange. I guess I'm too used to being your student." "I'd love to," she said, smiling a bit in how the words made the knight's eyes light up. "What are we playing?" Time crawled by agonizingly slowly. They'd received the late-night light message from Linhard and the others. Now they were creeping closer to the stubborn old general, pointing weapons at every shadow as nerves grew more strained by the waiting game. The worst part of it was that Byleth couldn't afford to show that she was nervous, or else everyone else would lose morale. Claude and Dimitri were stuck in the same boat, and it was only in the few moments they were able to steal for themselves that they were able to vent their less than confident feelings about what was to come. I don't know how Rodrigue and Judith do it, Byleth thought morosely on the morning of the second day, watching the two chat amicably as if they were just on a casual trip in the Empire rather than the leaders of a counter-invasion force. Maybe they'll share some secrets if I ask. The time did come, however. The army approached Fort Mercers, now visible even through the dense foliage, the early morning light bathing the massive stone fortress in pale gold rays. "Easy there, girl. Easy," Lysithea hissed, tugging on Maia's reins. The black Pegasus snorted and stomped on the ground impatiently. "Kman, don't give me that. We'll be in the air very soon, I promise." "They are frustrated from being under tree cover for so long," Constance said in her quiet daylight persona. Her Pegasus was not much better behaved, beating his wings meaningfully to vocalize his desire. Being unable to see the sky makes Pegasi reckless. "Well, they need to stay calm for a few minutes longer," Claude murmured. Ivory growled lowly, nosing the edge of the treeline and staring intently at the gates directly in front of them. "I wonder if Mitya and the others are having this much trouble with their mounts." The army was split in half, one taking the northern gate, Byleth, and Claude's taking the south. In spite of what she'd honestly expected, each side was a mix of kingdom and alliance troops, each choosing which side they thought their talents would be most useful at. The sign of unity raised her spirits, to be honest. Everyone was ready, now they were just waiting for a sign. "You don't think they were caught?" Bernadetta asked anxiously, patting Nico's mane as he snorted and threw his head back. "They'll make it," Leonie said with cool confidence. Her fingers were rock solid along the length of her reinforced silver bow, her quiver was heavy with arrows, including anti-beast arrowheads. Every archer had at least a few in their quivers, considering how many beasts they had seen already, while the intricate webbing of her brave lance glinted in the low light. Byleth narrowed her eyes against the glare as she peered up at the stone battlements so high above them. Occasionally she could see one or two men patrolling its length, but they were the night shift, and their rounds were ponderous and spaced well apart. Few people are awake. They might also just be confident. This fort has withstood many sieges. Good thing we're not putting it to siege then. Do we have the men to hold this fortress after we capture it? Lawrence asked with a slight frown, looking up at its walls. Byleth grimaced. He had a good point. They couldn't afford to leave more than a skeleton guard to man the fortress if they wanted to maintain their strength moving onward. If all goes well, the Empire will be too preoccupied to try and reclaim it, she said. Edelgard's decision to fight on two fronts was proving to be both a bane and boon for them. "Goddess, give us strength," Marianne murmured. "I'll do what I can," Suthies responded with only a faint sense of humor. She was still troubled by the memory they'd both witnessed. Byleth sent a wave of sympathy and warmth toward her friend. "Ah, no need for that, I'm paying attention to the situation in front of us, I promise." Yet the goddess's gratitude filtered through nonetheless. A light flickered through the openings of the gate. Byleth's breath hitched, the light flickered once, twice, 3 times, and then groaned as they started to open. "Come," she ordered. "Come without shouts and horns, today, we land our first true strike against the Empire, let our determination speak for itself." With that, and a barrage of muted cheers, she threw herself forward, leaving the trees and bolting for the entrance that was opening up before her. She could see Linhard and 2 men with him turning and blasting away at what few men had been guarding the gate before scrambling outside, pushing power through her legs. She reached them a minute later, lashing out the sword of the Creator and knocking down the man who had managed to avoid the defector's lance strikes and got out one frantic blow of a warning horn. "Good to see you, Professor," Linhard said, smiling at her. "Things got a bit tense there a couple times." He shook his head. "I always found Juritsah a little unsettling, but his Death Knight persona is much worse. Honestly, it's hard to fathom how they're the same person." "Well, worry about that later. Mount up with Marianne, the rest of you, join up with your unit." With those orders, Byleth rushed into the fort proper, waiting just long enough to see their nods of acceptance. The inside of Fort Mercers was remarkable if only for its sheer size. It was a winding maze with dead ends, a number of raised platforms for its multiple ballistics, 2 separate barracks and houses for civilians to theoretically retreat to in an invasion. Likely there weren't many, if any, here now. They had avoided sacking any of the villages in their path, buying supplies at a slightly lower price to avoid bitterly alienating the civilians that would survive the war. Byleth darted straight to the wall between her and line of sight of the northern gates, punching her feet into the wall and swinging herself up onto the top. Balancing on the thin wall, she saw the gate hanging wide open and their people pouring through. While she couldn't see Dorothea herself, likely she was swept up in the crowd and would continue her role as a medic. Linhard didn't indicate that she'd been caught. However, the one blast of that warning horn had been enough to rouse the troops in the wall. Amazingly, even in the brief time as various battalions formed up and the army began to march inward, the Imperial troops were pouring out of the barracks, armed and ready for a fight. She had to admire their readiness, if nothing else. She couldn't recall another opponent who'd had such a fast reaction time in the early morning. They must have known that we were nearby, at least, even if they didn't expect the trick. For the Emperor! A voice shouted, and the Empire rushed to meet them. Byleth immediately cast her eyes around for the ballistics as Constance's bolting and Lysithea's Hades Omega fell from the heavens and crashed into the ground in 2 different directions. Take the streets. Hold the corners. Reach to our friends at the other gate. She waved at Hannah, who was flying close to her, and called out, "Point me at one of the 4 priority targets." Hannah pointed her spear northeast of where she currently stood. Gesturing with her sword in acknowledgement, Byleth threw aura at the warrior running straight at her, knocking him flat on his back and burning him badly. Leaping over him, she brought the Creator's sword down on a silver lance, snapping it in half before slamming her fist into the soldier's face, knocking him back a step. An arrow whipped over her shoulder and slammed into the man's arm, sending him to his knee. Byleth then planted her foot on said shoulder and used him as a platform to jump up onto another knight's horse. The woman cursed in disbelieving shock, twisting and trying to bring her sword up. Instead, Byleth casually grabbed the back of the woman's leather and threw her off the horse single-handedly. The mount reared back, but she was prepared, backflipping and letting the momentum carry her back to the ground. The 2 soldiers who'd been intending to meet her there were shot by Bernadetta and Leone, who were racing side by side through the infantry, destroying their attempts to form defensive lines. Byleth straightened up and cast aura again, this time aiming for the midst of a group of armored knights. The men were sent staggering apart, several tearing at melting portions of the metal that was meant to protect them. A barrage of fireballs from the back line of her own mages flew over her head and rained upon those men. Byleth flinched at the resulting screams and began to run again, making her way down one of the twisting roads of the fort with her students at her heels. At a corner, there was a tortured scream that quickly morphed into the roar of a demonic beast. That was quickly followed by a blazing white light overhead that blasted down into from the sky and struck the monster, judging by its pained screech. Lysithea flew in a circle overhead, moving out of the way so Claude could take her place and firing a golden arrow to make good on the damage Seraphim would have done to the beast's magic protective barrier. Be careful for demonic beasts. Leone, stick close to me, I'm going to break a ballista. Got it, Captain, Leone called back. Byleth almost turned to look for her father. Almost. But she caught herself at the last second and blinked a few times to refocus. Help Lysithea and Claude with that demonic beast and its handlers. She yelled back at the others as they reached the stone wall separating out one of the walled-off areas that lead into the barracks. A general sound of understanding hit her ears. Trusting them to do the job, she turned sharply and ran across the road to its end where it connected to what might be the main concourse in the middle of Fort Mercers. The 2 raised platforms that the physical ballista rested upon were on each side of the main road. They were already crawling with archers by the time Byleth reached them. Grimacing, she took a flying jump up onto the one closer to her while Leone laid down covering fire for her. 2 archers were hit in the throat and stomach by her arrows as Byleth landed in their midst. She swung the Creator's sword, slashing one archer's arm to render her powerless and unleashing the blade's whip form on the other, slicing his throat and dropping him. Kicking out the knee of a soldier and sending his sword spinning off the side of the platform, Byleth spun around and pointed her hand at the ballistic. Ragnarok, she whispered. The massive blaze of fire burst from her fingers, slamming into the wooden structure and consuming it instantly. rendering it useless. Smiling faintly at her handiwork, Byleth turned around only to suddenly find herself face to face with a familiar figure. "I have waited for you," the Death Knight said. His one red eye blazed within his helmet, his scythe, fully repaired, was held loosely in one hand. "We have not finished our duel." Byleth gazed coolly back at him, then gestured sharply. Leonie let out a noise of protest, but after a second she nodded in acceptance and returned her attention to the other foot soldiers. "No," Byleth said in a cold voice as her friend left the danger zone. "No, we did not." She knew without being able to see that the Death Knight was grinning beneath his helmet. Then they met in a shower of sparks. Chapter 59, Interlude. "I care not that he has the pedigree for the rank, I care about whether or not he can do his job, which this pathetic display has convinced me he is too petty, short-sighted, and weak-willed to possibly perform as needed." She scowled at the noble brat in front of her, who attempted to sneer but quickly cowered under her gaze. She turned to find Ladislava still kneeling where she'd been knocked down, and made a point of examining the series of reports in her hand. Ladislava, class representative, graduated with top honors, regularly praised for conduct and results. "Why is someone so capable only holding the rank of sergeant?" "My parents are merchants, my lady," Ladislava said bluntly, and promptly flinched, bowing even deeper in apology. Forgive me, your majesty, I forgot myself." "All is forgiven. After 4 years being surrounded by simpering sycophants, I find your bluntness refreshing." Edelgard tossed her hair over one shoulder. "Now stand up, General. We have work to do." The missive was sitting on the table in front of her. Haneman tried to take it away more than once, but Edelgard absently batted his hand away. She continued to review it, as if hoping that if she read it enough times, she could figure out where she'd gone wrong and what to do next. Could Suthisa's power be so intense now after transfiguring Byleth into her avatar that there was no way she could possibly gain the upper hand in a battle? Her army had gone in with every advantage. They'd had a subverted alliance lord open the gates for them, they'd had total surprise, they'd had siege mages carried into the sky on mounts, she'd left nothing to chance. It was a perfect knockout blow. Claude could only have sway over Dimitri, and without him and Rodrigue Frildarius the kingdom be broken up into lords who could be swayed or dealt with in turn, and the alliance should have, crumbled under a strong wind. Yet Gloucester had bluntly rejected her overtures, to Hubert's complete disbelief. Almost spitting in the face of logic, neither Lord Frildarius nor Dimitri were killed, the demonic beasts that had been deployed didn't even slow Byleth down, and Claude had rallied the combined armies into a counter-attack that scored a victory with lower casualties than he had any right to under the circumstances. Ladislava was dead, Akiran was dead, and whoever hadn't fled or been killed had been captured. It beggared belief, and yet Edelgard knew it was because of Suthisa's gift to Byleth. Or was it just Suthi's now? Had she merged with Byleth's body so completely that night in the tomb that she took her place, sending her human soul onward to her personal afterlife while moving to prevent my removal of her beast's control over Fodlan? She took away part of Byleth's precious humanity that night. Who's to say she won't take all of it if she deems it necessary? It wasn't something she'd voice. Never mind the threat of her people being swayed back to their old opium of choice should they realize that their precious goddess was walking the world. The already unsteady morale of her lords and generals would plummet if they were told that their opponent could turn back time until she turned the odds in her favor. A warrior of the goddess, with the bladed king on her right and Lord Regan on her left. I'm afraid there was no hope of us recovering her body or even her armor. The Mad Boy King took exception to her attack upon his foreign manservant and unleashed Eridbar upon her. The sight was gruesome beyond words. What sort of monster is he to inflict that on a fellow human? Edelgard bit her lip, the hard rock in her stomach hard to ignore even as she reached for the ice that kept her strong and hardened her resolve. The stunned silence that had fallen over the war table once the report had been read through the first time had said more than words could have hoped to about the effect this would have on Imperial morale. Once again, her attempt to win a victory without leaning on Agartha had been crushed. She couldn't even claim a partial victory like she could after the siege of Garag Mach. This was a loss, pure and simple. Forced to rely on them again, and Claude is pushing me to it. I must attempt a change of tactics to take them out now. Mercifully, they no longer had nothing to show for their efforts. The javelins of light had devastated the famed northern fortress, the Silver Maiden, in the last message sent by Caspar's father, whom she'd assigned to lead the attack against Faergus. He'd reported they'd managed to secure a bulkhead within the cold north. Even that news was tinged with trouble, however. It had quickly become apparent that Holst Goneril, Hilda's older brother, likely a close ally of Claude who would require no arm-twisting to go along with his plans, why hadn't she thought about taking the pink-haired girl hostage? Extra pressure on the alliance would have encouraged it to fracture and fall apart, even with Claude's bizarre charisma to maintain order, had traveled to Faergus alongside a few contingents of Edmund troops and his own men to provide assistance to the kingdom. Her two-pronged attack had been anticipated. A combined Faergus and Alliance army had repelled Lord Burgess in a few engagements. That proof that they were committed to the alliance between their nations would endear the kingdom to the neighbors they were once antagonistic to. Which presented her more problems than it would otherwise. They would be much less likely to break, and self-serving nobles less likely to bow to her, than if they had been separated as they'd been mere months ago. It was frustrating. They'll hit Fort Mercers next. It's the only logical target if they intend to strike at Inver, she said, cutting through the low and panicky dialogue between the lower lords who had replaced the treacherous Seven as a makeshift council. Lady Varley scowled at this, though she didn't speak. She'd demanded the guaranteed safety of her daughter in exchange for the resources of her house, which Edelgard hadn't thought anything of granting at the time. Yet Bernadetta, timid, frightened, meek Bernadetta, had not only defied orders to return home, but by all accounts was fighting on the front lines of the Holy Allies. She was always clinging to Byleth, absorbing the strength that she exuded without even trying. If we managed to slay the Professor with a javelin of light, she'd undoubtedly be in the blast radius. Should Lady Varley realize the missiles are no natural phenomenon or accident of fate, but my and my uncle's machinations, she would undoubtedly withdraw her support and uproot all of Varley's territory to spite me for it. As if I needed another reason to keep those blasted weapons a closely guarded secret. She needed the missiles to take out Byleth, or at least incapacitate her should she use the goddess's power to block them. She preferred incapacitate, hoped that the massive, terrifying power that the unlocked sword of the Creator had revealed during the siege of Garreg Mach would save Byleth from death itself. She would much rather bring Byleth to Inver. Perhaps the Agarthans could do one good deed and through some magic surgery remove what connected her to Suthes, make her human again. It was plain from Captain Geralt's open mistrust of Rhea, oh, how it burned that Cronia had murdered the man and with it any hopes of swaying Byleth to her side, that he believed she'd done something to his daughter. Likely some experiment when she was a child after Citri's death to make her a suitable host for Suthes. The beast wouldn't have cared about one solitary human life, when she already ruined thousands by forcing crest worship upon humanity. And I need that missile to hit Claude, too. Edelgard frowned at the report again. She was fighting to reconcile the blasé, frivolous, never serious boy with the strategist described in the reports. It wasn't the storied nobles who reformed the army in their frantic scrambling to respond to the ambush, it was a boy hastily named Lord at the last minute in the face of his grandfather's advanced age and sickness. He'd bought time for people to arm themselves, moving units forward and backward in cycles until everyone was prepared, used hit and run tactics as well as clever use of his family relic's unique power to buy time until the lines were formed and a unified front could press forward to reclaim the bridge. Perhaps even more so than Dmitri, Claude clearly had to be made a priority target, not for whose son he was, but what he was clearly capable of. She'd ordered Hubert to send messages throughout the troops to make that clear. Not that she could neglect Dmitri, as Ladislava's death had proven painfully clear. But it was obvious that he was the weak link among the leaders, half-mad, his laughter in the chamber, manic behavior in battle, an absurd fixation on the idea that she had somehow betrayed him made that clear, and likely reliant on Claude for strategy and Byleth to keep himself alive in battle. He was a destructive monster to fight, however. Anyone who wielded Eridbar was. Your Majesty, who will replace General Ladislava on the Eastern Front? Lord Herveying asked in a tone that suggested he'd tried to get her attention once already. Edelgard waved dismissively at him. I have narrowed down the list of candidates to a handful of the best of the best. I'll have another leader out in the field by tomorrow evening, never you fear. Meaning I've narrowed it down to people I can halfway trust, she thought sourly. Hubert could take command, yes, he's prepared all his life for such tasks, but I am loath to send him out without a more experienced commander to provide him backup. And I'm dangerously close to having to let Lord Varley out of house arrest to lead the charge, or I'll end up with too many Agarthans in powerful positions. Edelgard loathed Count Maximus Varley with a passion. Even in small matters, the man had no concept of collateral damage. Blood, slaughter, and ruin would follow him should he be put at the head of an army against foes who were encroaching on what he considered his land. However, the man was competent, infuriatingly enough, and he'd been pleading for his release by swearing up and down that he would be loyal to her and recognized her as the sole autocrat in power over Adrestia. It will be a black day if I have to take him up on that, she thought bitterly. Fortunately, she still had a few options before she had to stoop to that. For now. The fact loomed over her, causing a burning resentment to linger in her stomach. Had things proceeded as planned, if Gloucester hadn't miraculously found his spine and slash or some sense of loyalty that he'd been missing all his life before this moment, if Byleth had been captured in the Holy Tomb, or if that stupid bandit had managed to do the one thing his kind was capable of and killed Claude and Dimitri, the Empire would have indirect control over swaths of the Alliance and Kingdom without all this bloodshed and loss of Imperial lives. Her army wouldn't be in disarray and she wouldn't deal with so many would-be allies glancing nervously at her whenever she proposed the next leg of their plan. She wouldn't have needed those damned missiles to score her first real victory. They'll be turned back at Fort Mercers. The stubborn old general has never been taken since its construction, one new army man whose name she couldn't remember said confidently. They're armed with more relics than any one army has amassed since the church in Sherdlug could succeed from Adrestia, including the Sword of the Creator. Edelgard said dryly. After Gareg Mach, I'm not willing to put anything in the hands of fate. If they somehow breach Mercers, they can march across the countryside, Lady Varley said incredulously. They could travel in any direction and do untold damage to our infrastructure before we can move to confront them. We must call back some of the troops that went with Lord Burghley's to reinforce the home front. It's the best way to ensure the safety of our people. Calling back any part of the army, no matter how small, will undercut any attempt made to recapture and hold lands in Faerghus, Edelgard retorted, resisting the urge to rub her temples in annoyance. She was one more meeting away from dismissing her council completely and running the war with only Hubert and Han Amon for advisors. They were the only one giving her useful advice. The rest were busy wringing their hands about the cost of this war and how it might outstrip the gains they would make in the reunification. Edelgard resisted the urge to curse at them. Nothing was too much to take Fodlan back from the beast and her worshippers. No price was too high to free the people imprisoned by the systems of lords and crests. If only the deep and loving loyalty of her army extended to the lords, then at least she'd have useful allies that weren't megalomaniac monsters like the Agarthans. Your Majesty, a harsh, icy voice cut through the pointless chatter. Edelgard stood up and turned, giving Myson an icy look. She might tolerate him the most out of his ilk. He was a legitimate strategist and was much less inclined to treat her like a particularly intelligent horse than his fellows, but that didn't mean he had leave to interrupt her unless it was very important. If you do not have news, I would like to know what you think you're doing, alchemist, she said dryly. Your lord uncle says that you spoke of a substitute for a military matter that you were opposed to, Myson said evenly, not even pretending to be either intimidated by or respectful to her implicit anger. He didn't acknowledge the council, which was muttering angrily at his brazen interruption. He sent me with the substitute that he believes will meet your needs. Might I present them to you now, since progress has yet to be made by your council? I would chastise you, but you're right. Just don't mistake this tolerance of you for a level of actual fondness. It seems I do, in fact, have a few minutes to spare, she said scathingly, glaring at the table. Everyone there winced or looked down in a mixture of shame and anger. Hubert gave her a worried look and stood up to join her. Show me. Myson nodded, turning on his heels and leaving the room. Edelgard followed after him with Hubert at her heels, giving a glare over her shoulder that served as a wordless warning that there had better be some sort of plan by the time she returned. Casper's father is the only one who truly makes himself indefensible. The rest are typical nobles, weak-willed and indecisive as soon as the tides seem threatening. They took a winding pathway down into the basement. Edelgard soon found herself frowning as she slowly realized where Myson was leading her. There was a chamber prepared there, meant to hold Rhea as insurance against Agartha and to supply more blood to create stronger demonic beasts. What manner of substitute are we speaking of? Hubert asked in his usual cold, haughty tone. If he was uneasy, he refused to show it. It is better that I show you. Walls have ears, after all, Myson responded. His words were even as ever, lacking the condescension that Arundel so often showed her. Edelgard frowned. Has your new alchemist created a new form of demonic beast? I'd been told that more research was required. No, it is not a demonic beast. They reached the hallway that led to the massive double doors that would have been Rhea's prison. They are something far more precious, and far less expendable than the beasts. As a matter of fact, it took much convincing on my part for them to be brought here. Your lord uncle believed the situation was not dire enough to bring them out. Not dire enough. Edelgard scoffed. He wants to hide a powerful weapon until our doors are being dashed. She wasn't able to finish her sentence. A scream interrupted her, followed by a sickening crunch that could only be human bones being pulverized by intense force. Myson swore in the harsh language of his people and ran forward, having the nerve to order her to stay put before hammering on the door and raising a strange square above his head. There was a red jewel in it, which he hit hard with 2 fingers. The racket that had been ringing from within the chamber ceased, except for a muted thud and a terrified, indistinct babbling from a number of people within. Hubert grabbed her arm when she took a few steps forward to investigate. Worry lay behind the alarm in his expression as he stared at the door. I apologize for that, Myson said. He actually sounded a little concerned, which rather undermined his meant-to-be soothing tone because that man never showed emotion. These particular weapons can be volatile. We're still trying to discern why. Is this safe? Hubert demanded. Completely. I have the means to control them in my hand, Myson responded reassuringly. Please, do come in. I assure your safety, your majesty. Edelgard watched the door uneasily for a moment, wondering what could have caused such an impact if not a demonic beast. But she shook her head after a moment, shaking off Hubert's iron grip and striding forward. A substitute for those damned missiles is too valuable to be ignored. Myson opened the doors and strode inside, stepping to the side so Edelgard could see what had been brought to her. For a moment, she wasn't sure exactly what was being presented. Then the 2 beings stood, fully illuminating themselves in the low light, and her heart attempted to evacuate her body via her throat. From a distance, you might confuse them for 2 normal human beings, one rather tall, 6 feet at least and clearly male, while the other was petite and female judging by her hips. But once you stepped closer enough to look at them, the only word that came to mind was wrong. Their skin was pale, translucent, and dead. She knew it was dead, only flesh that was close to rotting looked like that, yet the skin was also pale, smooth, and unblemished except for varying scars. Their veins were not blue-violet, but a reddish gold. They stood unnaturally still, seemingly not even breathing. Were they even breathing? She wasn't sure she could see. Their hair was bleached of color, their eyes glowing a malevolent red that reminded her of the beast's monster form. They looked human, they had to be human, yet they were so wrong. She felt something almost like a scream building up in her throat the longer she looked at them. So she glanced aside, and saw an Agarthan body slumped against the floor, their head thoroughly pulped with blood and gore splattering the wall and floor. Blood dripped off the tall man's, man. Could she call this thing a man, hand, and only his hand? As if he'd used that one hand to kill that person. She'd seen one person perform such feats of strength. Just one. It ran in one human family. Slowly her eyes trailed to his back. A massive spear was strapped across the thing's back. It glowed a soft gold, and it was bent in the opposite direction of the familiar relic. Disbelief ran underneath the wrong consuming her mind as she stared at him, slowly transferring her gaze to the woman. She held in her hand a much more elegant black lance, the design of which she'd seen before from reports Hubert had stolen for her, the arrow of Indra. The 2 beings glared at her, the male one with hatred, the female one with contempt. What is this? She demanded. For the first time since her siblings had died, her voice shook. What are they? They are the first true transhumans. Myson said approvingly. They were the next step towards humanity's ascension. They've been preserved for some time, to be kept safe. That's why they look a little unnerving at first glance. Look at them, our greatest successes, our treasured Ubermensch. Magnificent, aren't they? She couldn't speak. Hubert said nothing, even though he was the first with a witty retort to Agarthan pretensions of grandeur. He too was struck dumb by the sight. Another Eridbar. Impossibly, a duplicate of the bladed relic. As she stared at the being's face, wrong wrong, she started to see a familiar facial shape in that sickly, dead skin and those blazing inhuman eyes. No, that's impossible, it can't be, it can't, that makes no sense, I'm looking for something familiar in something so wrong, she told herself firmly. They are worth more than entire battalion on the battlefield, Myson went on, a smile on his face. Even the beast knew well to fear them. He was cut off mid-sentence, almost faster than the eye could see. The tall man moved. Myson let out an audibly panicked curse, leaping backwards and hitting the ruby on the box again. The male being staggered, a gurgling noise deep in his throat, pausing with his hands mere inches from his throat. Though I think that the long sleep they endured has left them disoriented and confused. Being resettled into the living world ought to make them settle down, Myson finished a little awkwardly. Why you? Edelgard was seized with a shudder so bad her knees almost buckled. The female being had spoken, rather than attempt to attack Myson like her companion, she'd walked forward a few steps and fixed her unerring gaze on her. Then she'd spoken. Spoken. Her voice was hideously distorted, human yet not human in a way almost indistinguishable from Rhea. The being had stared at her for a moment. She had searched for something within her, and hadn't found it, or perhaps she had. She let out a crackling, twisted noise that Edelgard slowly realized was mocking laughter. Why you, little, f-u-l-l-l. Chapter 60. Go forth. And fear no darkness. Dmitri did worry sometimes that he wasn't as charismatic as Claude. He knew that he was young and that his troubles lay underneath his voice, tangible if you knew to look for them. One of his current fears was that he wasn't strong enough to present a figure worth following. But at the earth-shaking cheers that filled the world around him as his army surged forward, blowing through the gates that Dorothea had opened for them, fought hard to put that fear to rest. He just barely saw Falry of Geralt's mercenaries sweep the young songstress up onto the back of her horse before he was within the enemy's walls. His friends surged around him in formation at the front, even as he rushed from the front line into the winding open halls and platforms of Fort Mercers. His heart keened at that gesture of trust, at how Felix was at his left side keeping pace in spite of everything he'd ever said to his old friend, at how Sylvain and Ingrid were moving ahead and taking the position of his honor guards. Didier was right behind him as they smashed into the first line of Empire soldiers that had scrambled from their beds to oppose them. Surprise had been total. The united army poured in unopposed through both entrances. Most of them had made it in before the warning horns began to blow in earnest. Panicked shouting and cursing came from every direction. Annette, get up on that ballistic, use it at your discretion. Men, protect your battalion leader. Dmitri ordered. Annette being on foot was more of a risk inside the walls of Fort Mercers due to the twin risks of being trampled in the chaos and fighting within the ranks of the cavalry rather than from the semi-safer position of behind them while they charged ahead. Got it. Merci, come up with me, you'll be better able to see who needs healing with the looking glass. The orange-haired mage urged even as she kicked the wall and climbed up onto the raised surface. A mage emerged from a trapdoor beneath it, but Annette didn't give him a chance to take in the situation. She threw a hand axe at his head, hitting him between the eyes and dropping him back down the ladder. Of course, the blonde gasped, her expression brightening at the easy means to stay on top of the army's injuries. Being one of a handful of mages capable of casting Fortify while also possessing the Lamine crest, her being able to see and reach everyone she could was crucial. She hesitated for a second, however, in order to snag Didier's arm and catch up with him long enough to plant a kiss on his cheek. Be careful, she pleaded quickly, staring soulfully into his wide eyes for a second that must have seemed like an eternity to her. Then she darted off to Gilbert, who helped her up to join Annette, who was dropping bricks and broken stone on top of the trapdoor to keep it from being opened again. Dmitri couldn't help but chuckle, sending a warrior flying with one well-placed kick and pausing in order to pat his stunned retainer on the shoulder. My friend, I do believe you've just been ordered to live, he said kindly. Please don't leave me, Claude's trembling voice echoed in his head. He would never forget the look in those green eyes. Seeing it reflected in Mercedes's kind face felt like a jolt directly along his spine. Dida swallowed, even as he turned and blocked an axe on his gauntlets. I understand, he said shakily. Dmitri stabbed his opponent with his silver lance, causing him to drop his weapon. Dida surged forward and preformed a 1-2 punch that dented the man's chest armor, dropping him to the ground. Is this really the time for that? Felix griped. Before twisting his wrist and taking a stance, Dmitri had only seen Catherine use in practice before. Before his amazed eyes, in a blur of motion accented by the blazing light of his crest, Felix preformed Astra, the ultimate technique of the sword master as taught by Gareg Mach, the move that he'd spent the entire school year griping about not being able to perfect. Glenn had first used it at 15. That was what had convinced father to knight him so young, flawlessly. Letting his momentum carry him, the blue-haired boy not only obliterated the armored knight standing in front of him but also diced apart the hero standing behind him. Says the man who'd rather fight a horde of demonic beasts than tell Bernadetta he's sweet on her. Sylvain fired at him as his horse rode past the sword master, silver lance lashing out and stabbing a mage mid-cast of death. Shut up! Felix snapped, his face rapidly turning crimson. Glenn laughed, unleashing Astra on the mounted knight, cutting through the saddle, leg, and blade in the blink of an eye. You should think of it as a challenge, Felix. He said, in the cheerfully annoying way he'd often used when teasing any of them years ago. Are you saying that mastering Astra is harder than being honest? Like I need to hear that from you. You needed me to lock you in the greenhouse before you were able to tell Ingrid that you wanted to marry her out of love, not because it was arranged. Felix raged as he blocked the blade of an enemy sword master who'd appeared from around a blind corner. The ballista Annette was now manning behind them roared to life, throwing an orb of blazing fire over their heads to land somewhere deeper in the fortress. If I were you, I wouldn't be offering any ideas right now. Glenn responded, blushing lightly at the reminder. Then he swore, darted forward about a yard and slashed a sniper's bow in half. Seconds later, Ingrid swooped down and slammed the flat of Lewin's blade into the face of a bishop, knocking him out of the fight. That's not funny, damn it! Felix yelled, whirling around after slicing the swordmaster's dominant arm and slamming the hilt of his sword into his face. Sylvain, if you scare her off with your stupid antics, I swear by the blazing flames dash. A wave of fire blew past Sylvain, taking out a mage who had been mid-cast of dark spikes. Atra appeared from the general blur of the united army and smacked the horse's hip, causing her to jump forward and miss the fatal blast of black magic. Whoa! Sylvain gasped, then let out a shaky laugh. Thanks for the save, Atra, you're beautiful when you're charging in like an avenging angel. Atra responded the same way she always did when Sylvain tried his flirting with her, a strangled noise that was halfway between confusion and incredulity. You're welcome, was all she managed to say in response. Dmitri chuckled and remarked, you might want to say something before he has the chance to screw it up for you, you know, he dared to tease his old friend for the first time in, he wasn't sure how long. Like you did? Felix asked dryly. What? Did you blink twice after beating a sniper that had been trying to shoot down Annette into submission? What do you mean? Sylvain, Dmitri said in a loud, warning voice. Hey, you just said not to tell Rodrigue. The redhead protested. You bloody well know I didn't mean just him. He hasn't told anyone other than Felix and Glenn, Ingrid promised as they ran forward, deeper into the roads of Fort Mercers. There were a number of areas through which reinforcements could come through, doors to secret passageways beneath the ground, stairwells to the upper walls, the works. They would have to take them one by one to ensure that they had full control over the fortress. I made sure of it. Wait, so that wasn't a joke? Felix sputtered, nearly missing another swordmaster taking a swing at him. Atra darted between them, caught the blade on one of her swords and swung the flame blade at the man's chest, igniting his robes. Cursing, Felix spun and kicked the man in the gut to make him drop his sword. The man dropped and tried to put out the flames by rolling. As if Dmitri would joke about being in love, Glenn retorted, the bemusement on his face much more muted than it would have been if he'd had all his memories, yet it was familiar nonetheless. It's everything else I'm still trying to get my head around. "You're all demoted," Dmitri informed them mock seriously as he took point against a wall. A reinforcement point had been indicated beyond it. "Archers. 2 within, 1 up on the wall." "Give me a moment," Atra said determinedly. She darted around the wall straight out into the open. Dmitri choked and tried to snag her arm, just barely missing her. The painful mix of emotions that he usually felt around her was replaced entirely by shock and alarm. What was she thinking? A number of arrows whipped past him out of the wall. Seconds later, a wave of fire from her sword was visible, aimed upward, not forward. He tracked its progress up the wall to expertly strike the upper battlements, catching the flag and wooden railings, forcing the sniper posted there to flee. "Ingrid!" Atra called from within, followed seconds later by a pained yelp. Ingrid flew down in a dive bomb. A sickening crunch signaled her victory. Dmitri swung around into the spacious room proper. Atra had an arrow pierced through her shoulder, yet she was still moving, her flame sword slashing through the bow of the last archer before she retreated several steps from the approaching knights. Urged forward by an odd swell of emotion, Dmitri shot forward, grabbed a discarded javelin off the ground and threw it. The weapon slammed through the visor of the lead knight, killing him and causing him to crumble, tripping up his fellows. The warm light of Lamine flared in a ball of light above Atra's head. Glenn paused at her side long enough to pull the arrow out. Then he charged the 3 armored knights, Astra flaring to life along with his minor crest that helped him slice through the armor and render the 3 enemies bleeding and powerless. Dmitri moved past her for the moment, stopping a charging mounted knight by reaching out and snagging the reins. The horse skidded to a stop, allowing Dmitri to grab its rider and yank him off his mount, causing him to crash to the ground. Letting go of the reins, Dmitri subdued the man with one well-placed kick to the face as Ingrid threw a javelin at the upper battlements to deal with a straggler, while Sylvain had reached the entrance with part of an allied armored battalion, seizing it and demanding the surrender of the knights still inside the tunnel. The ear-splitting crash of bolting struck down again, followed by another blast from Annette's ballista, as Dmitri made his way back to Atra. She was adjusting her coat, with nothing but the way she was biting her lip and the bloodstains to indicate the pain she was still feeling. "Atra," he started, and then stopped. She froze up and stared back at him, eyes wide and uncertain. Dmitri fumbled for words, wondering what exactly he wanted to say. "Thank you? Why? Do you want to die?" "Be more careful," was what he found himself saying after a moment, calm and even a little beseeching. "You are in the center of a storm in my heart. I feel like I can't forgive you, yet the thought of doing so still lingers on my mind when I hear you speaking. Can't die here." The renegade Agarthan nodded dumbly in response, her lips parted, but she didn't say anything except a confused "as you wish." "Form up. Secure the point and prepare to move again," Dmitri yelled after giving his head a quick shake to clear it. The red was mercifully at a fairly low ebb. Somehow, the screaming wasn't getting to him. The enemies weren't fighting to the death nearly so much as they had been on the bridge, and, somehow, his head just felt clear. Annoyance with Sylvain babbling to Glenn and Felix about his loves was surprisingly prominent among the storm of feelings he was experiencing. As he led his friends and warriors out of the area they had secured, Dmitri spared a few seconds to look up at the sky, scanning for Ivory. She was harder to spot in the morning light compared to a storm. Maia, and thus Lysithea, was plainly visible, along with the other Pegasi and Wyverns who made up their aerial forces. Thankfully for his nerves, a golden arrow flew down from the heavens and hit the ground directly across from him. Claude was moving and in no danger, if all the ballista have been seized. He couldn't see Byleth, but he knew he would simply have to keep faith in her. She was the one who'd taught them how to be warriors, and Suthies was watching over her. Yet still his heart twisted anxiously when he couldn't see them within this chaos. "Perhaps in the next battle we'll lead the army side by side." The army cheered and moved around him as he charged forward again, narrowly dodging a miasma spell cast at his head. "Where's the next?" he shouted into the air, hoping someone would answer him, and know what he was referring to. "It must be said." "Directly ahead of you, Your Majesty," Rodrigue said, his hand raised in mid-cast of Fortify. Dmitri felt the bruises and cuts he'd acquired melt away in a wave of warmth and smiled gratefully. "The Empire is massing in the middle around the Death Knight, who is in combat with Lady Eisner. We'll block them off, secure the rest of the fortress." "The Death Knight?" he snapped, feeling his stomach lurch. Rodrigue nodded, glancing off to the side. He's insisted on single combat, it seems. No one else is attempting to interfere, the rest are preoccupied. Dmitri slowed for a moment, forcing himself to take a deep breath. Trust the professor, Your Majesty, Didu urged him. There was a look in his friend's eyes, which kept flickering back the way they came, that made it clear he understood what he was feeling. The young king tightened his grip on the silver lance, Eridbar felt heavy on his shoulder. He fought with the urge to take his relic in hand and rush to Bylith's side. He had to preform his part of the plan. I know, he acknowledged. Yet it still terrified him to keep moving, leading his part of the army forward into the far side of Fort Mercers, leaving his beloved to fight the most dangerous knight Edelgard had to offer. Be careful, Bylith. An arrow hit him in the shoulder when he approached the eastern wall, causing him to spit a bit of blood and curse vehemently as he ducked behind some cover. Can we signal Constance somehow? He asked, twisting to look at the injury. A familiar figure melted out of the air, placing a hand around the arrow. I can. In fact, I can tell her to target the wall without needing her to land and talk to us first, Yuri assured him, his hands glowing with healing magic. Now I don't have the blood of Lamine or Cethline, so this is going to sting quite a bit. Do you need dash? No, the healing magic numbs it enough for me. Dmitri said. He gritted his teeth as the violet-eyed young man removed the arrow. His vision went gray for a brief moment before the pain was eased away by recover. Please signal her, or else we won't get past those archers. Done, Yuri said airily, stepping back and taking a pocket watch out of his coat. Nonchalantly he pointed his now free hand off to the side. Aura flew across a short distance and smashed into an armored knight that had been trying to reach them. Across the field, Ingrid had landed and was patting her Pegasus's neck as Glenn carefully freed the arrow that had struck it near its left wing joint. Atra was standing guard along with Felix, who kept glancing across the field. Looking for Bernadetta, probably. They had been fighting side by side in the last few engagements, hadn't they? Knowing that Annette and Mercedes were further back, in the area controlled by their people, eased his mind. Didu and Felix were hiding under cover on the other side of the entrance to the reinforcement area. The rest of the knights and men were scattered all about, healing, taking prisoners, or mirroring his friends in taking positions. You might want to back away a few feet, Yuri warned, startling him from his thoughts. His violet-eyed friend gave him a half-smile. There's bound to be a bit of a small avalanche in a moment. Dmitri blinked twice before his eyes widened in comprehension and he jumped back from the wall just seconds before bolting slammed into the ramparts above the reinforcement mustering point. Some awful screaming echoed from that area, and sure enough brick and stone rained down from where the damage had been done. Once the sound of falling stopped, Dmitri stole a glance around the wall and saw that the snipers that had been up on the ramparts with the sun behind them were gone, either fled or fallen. Onward! He ordered, charging into the area. Within were mostly armored knights and war masters. Oh, how Dmitri did not like fighting war masters. They were faster than they had any right to be. Their first blow paralyzed their victim for a flurry of follow UPS, and despite their comparative lack of armor they were stupidly resilient. All traits he admired in Didu, Balthus, and Raphael, but did not care to see in so many faceless enemies. He did respect their determination, however. Those who were fighting to protect the homes they feared they would lose otherwise. He understood that fear well, after all. Stepmother once said that every battle is a loss. Perhaps it's a mercy she didn't live long enough to see what her daughter would start. He hated thinking like that. The morale of the enemy had broken, that much was clear. To Dmitri's shock, when the soldiers in the area saw him approaching, they all dropped their weapons and fell to their knees in front of him. Mercy, King Blade did, one of them said. She sounded like a young woman. If not for me, for my sister's children who I now raise. They say you're kind, that you're gentle, please, Mercy. Her voice seemed to break a dam. Others raised similar pleas, causing Dmitri to slowly lower his lance as the litany of voices drew him to the realization that few of these soldiers were high-ranked. No. It was possible that the highest-ranked person in this fort was the Death Knight. No. These were the children of merchants and villager sons and daughters who had managed to snare admission into a military academy. For them to be openly surrendering like this, they must have had reservations about their emperor starting a war, but weren't able to go without their paycheck. I grant you mercy. Dmitri heard himself say the words more than anything else. His thoughts were strangely tangled. He gestured to one of the Gautier men whose name he didn't remember offhand, but he knew to be a good man. Lead them all outside, so they don't risk being caught in crossfire or retaliation. Secure the area. The Empire soldiers let out a ragged, almost singular cry of relief, many reaching out to touch his boots. Embarrassed by such a strong reaction to a basic display of compassion, Dmitri helped the woman who had first spoken stand up as the Gautier men circled them and lead them out toward the closest exit from the fortress. Taken care of, Sylvain informed him as the area was secured. Dmitri breathed out a sigh of relief and spun on his heels. You know, she's probably got the Death Knight all sewn up by now. I'll be at ease when I see that with my own eyes, Dmitri responded. Sylvain rolled his eyes good-naturedly, hiding his own concern for their professor. Atra rolled her shoulder back and looked around with a strange expression on her face. What's the matter, Morning Dove? Yuri asked, teasingly using Happy's nickname. The black-haired girl jumped and went quite red at the face, fidgeting under his attention. You look oddly ill at ease, considering we just got an objective handed to us without a fight. Oh, I don't know what to say. Atra bit her lip. I didn't see any Agarthans here. That seems very strange to me, since we know they're working closely with the Emperor. There weren't even any demonic beasts. Even though we had the element of surprise, it just feels strange. That's true, Dida said uneasily. Did anyone else see them? Felix scowled, clearly thinking furiously. Glenn? He asked through his teeth. His tone wasn't encouraging. Glenn's eyes narrowed. No, I don't remember seeing any either. I doubt there's much love between Agartha and the Emperor, for both want to rule the world. Maybe she wanted this place to be loyal solely to her. It's possible, Dmitri acknowledged through his teeth as he started to leave the area, though I'm not sure. Get out. The voice, amplified by a theater trick that Dorothea had shown off a few times during their year studying, cracked over their conversation. Dimitri's head jerked up at Lysithea's panicky voice. Even though she was the youngest, she never willingly showed fear, even maintaining a cold stoicism until after the end of the siege. Only in private did she allow herself to break down. For her to sound completely terrified? As far as he was concerned, no detailed explanation was needed. Orders from Her Grace Lady Eisner, get out of Fort Mercers now. Head for the hills beyond the Treeline. Now, without delay. Just abandon the fort. Sylvain blurted out. But we've almost Do what she says, Sylvain. Dmitri barked. His friend jolted but didn't argue. Dmitri grabbed his offered hand and was hauled up onto the mare's back. They bolted through the streets, Dmitri repeating the order bluntly and repeatedly while his friends scrambled to keep up. At first his commanders resisted, protesting that the fort was nearly won, but repeated commands managed to get through their heads and they fled for the exit. Dmitri looked about and caught sight of a white wyvern flying overhead. A bit of relief hit his chest as Ivory descended enough for him to see both Claude and Byleth safe on her back. Don't wait, Dmitri. Byleth shouted. We'll make sure everyone gets out, just go, don't wait. Hurry. She sounded scared, too. Dmitri felt his heart drop into his stomach. What was happening? Be careful. He called back up to them as Sylvain urged his horse to move just a little faster. The blue, gold, and white streams leading out to the hills were striking against the green landscape. Everyone had exited on the opposite side of the fort from which they'd entered, which while peppered with trees was largely a series of hilly grass fields. It gave them plenty of room to spread out and make room for each other. Something glittered in the sky. Dmitri almost dismissed it, distracted as he was. However, something about it nagged at his memory, and he heard Atra gasp. Anything that startled her was not a good sign. Lifting his head and looking up to the sky, Dmitri saw a golden-white streak blaze through the cloudless sky. It was a slender shape, moving like an arrow fired from a bow with its swiftness. It passed over their heads, over the Pegasi and wyverns as they left over the walls of the fort, but started to descend. To come closer and closer to the ground until it fell within the fort. He'd never heard anything like the noise that hit his ears then. The closest, indeed, only, comparison that jumped to mind was an avalanche. He'd seen a few of those in his childhood, though only from a distance. The impact was similar, too. He felt the ground shake underneath their feet. Sylvain's horse, and indeed all the mounts around him, stamped in place and neighed in alarm. The impact was followed by a massive burst of fire. Dmitri had seen paintings of the Valley of Torment, where jets of flame hotter than anything else in the living world occasionally burst from the earth, consuming all that was nearby. A dome of flame rose from within the walls, a wave of heat rolled through the air, washing over him even from the distance they stood at. Then he saw another flicker in the sky. Dmitri choked briefly before shouting, "Keep moving! Run to the far hill!" This time, his army needed no extra encouragement. Neither did Byleth's half of their forces, which were already on the move, going forward and to the right in order to merge up with them on the horizon. Sylvain kicked his mount into a gallop, rapid fire spitting a series of srang words without pausing for breath. Another impact slammed into the earth, shaking it badly. Dmitri looked over his shoulder and watched as another impact shattered the massive stone wall that had held back innumerable assaults over 900 years in a single blow. Fire burst up again in massive balls. It was orange and red and purple, unlike anything he'd ever seen before. His eyes stung from looking, but he couldn't help himself. He was frozen. Another missile hit. Another wall crumbled from the impact, stone spraying outward as if shoved by a massive force. The final one struck in the midst of that, the flames turning white, and finally Dmitri shut his eyes against the force that, even as he was carried away, he could still feel the heat and pressure as if it was chasing them, malevolently nipping at their heels. It was like seeing the breaking of the world. The Agarthans destroyed the world once before. Suthis's words rang in his head. I do not know if I can restore it in my current situation. When the army united on the hill, Dmitri found himself standing with Atra, Claude, Byleth, Rodrigue, Judith, and the Empire soldiers who had surrendered to him, staring at the smoking ruins that had once been Fort Mercers. There was simply nothing left. Not even foundations, only a massive crater where the stubborn old general had stood. Smoke billowed out of it, small fires burned here and there, but not by much. Dmitri let out a slow breath, staring at the impossible and terrifying sight before them. Atra? Rodrigue asked, his voice shaking. Dmitri hadn't heard him sound so shaken since the day he'd returned from Dusker 4 years ago. The young renegade had both hands over her mouth, wide-eyed, staring at the remains. Sie Cohen en nicked, we haben sie knock. She stammered out, seemingly not even realizing she'd slipped out of modern common. You recognize that? Judith asked. Her voice was steady, but the sheer paleness in her face spoke volumes. You didn't mention it before. Thales said they didn't have them anymore. Atra burst out, fear and horror in equal measure dripping from her voice. He said we abandoned the use of them against fellow humans, and used what few that remained against the fell star before the cataclysm. Thales, he and his men. Her voice was growing both weaker and higher, a harsh panicky edge entering her voice. They said, they were abandoned for being too damaging to the world. I know he lies, I know he always lied, but I thought he wanted to rule, I thought he wanted a world he could live in. Her words broke off into a choked-off sound that Dmitri recalled making himself when his emotions grew too powerful to suppress. Byleth slid off of Ivory's back and grabbed Atra's shoulders, turning her around and giving her a gentle but firm shake. Looking after another person always took priority for her. Breathe, she said firmly. I had a premonition this would happen and we have escaped. Breathe, Atra. Do not panic. She would have killed us. That voice belonged to the woman who'd spoken to Dmitri not long ago. The Empire soldier slowly wrapped her arms around herself, staring, as all her fellows were, at the ruins they had been charged to protect. I beg your pardon? Claude asked, his voice wound so tightly Dmitri almost didn't recognize it for a second. We weren't sent word, the young woman whispered. She was so terrified, so full of disbelief, that Dmitri didn't doubt her for a second. The Emperor said nothing, only ordered us to hold the fort when we were sent here months ago. If we had stayed, if we had not surrendered. The Emperor would have killed them all just to kill you, Byleth and Claude, his father finished dryly. Dmitri couldn't swallow around the lump in his throat, fear, and hundreds of other emotions running wild within his chest. Of course they don't care. Atra let out a shaky, humorless laugh. Panic bordering on madness lingered in those dark blue eyes, and she clung to Byleth's arms like they were a lifeline. Unverzy Lich. Please, in words we can understand, Rodri gasped tightly. Unverzy Lich, Atra repeated forcefully, as much to calm herself down as to make the declaration. The weight of her angry, hysterical tone made even his father's ghost wince. It's unforgivable. She is willing to kill the world so she can rule over its ashes. Dmitri heard Byleth's breath hitch, even as the Empire soldiers began to babble and beg for an explanation. The look on her face told him that she was thinking of the same words he was. Suthi's warning. Did Agartha truly hate them so much, so determined not to acknowledge them as fellow human beings, that they would rather destroy the world than risk losing it again? And Edelgard. Why, why? Why? I had a vision from Suthi's, Byleth said quietly. Let us set up camp, and set up the army so I might tell everyone at one time. This was no act of hers, but a weapon wielded against us. She bit her lip. And please inform Mercedes that I wish her to tend to Juritsai Hrym. He's too delirious to interrogate in the state he's in. Check the description for the links to the author.